Chapter 3:14. The feeling of impending death was like falling into an ice cellar. It was so cold that it penetrated his bones. A layer of frost appeared on the surface of his skin, and his whole body froze. Even though his opponent's sword had not reached his body, the coldness of the blade seemed to have penetrated his heart. Brendel felt his heart clench. At that moment he did not have any other thoughts, but he subconsciously tried his best to avoid this fatal blow. But it was too late. Time seemed to have stopped at that moment and he felt a slight sting on his back. Brando felt his nerves tense up. He could not help but think, did I fail? But at that moment, a blue light suddenly flashed from his body, and the sound of two swords clashing could be heard. The old man immediately retreated, and the blue light chased after him. The two of them clashed 10 times in an instant. This was the first time that Brando's grandfather was forced to retreat. He retreated to open up the distance between them, and when he looked at his sword, it was already broken in half. This dazzling scene happened in the blink of an eye. Everyone was covering their mouths as they watched Brando fall into a dangerous situation. But in the next moment, the situation was completely reversed. Brando was still in the same position when he was attacked, and when he turned his head, he saw the light blue figure standing between him and his grandfather, or rather, blocking the attack of the four people. It was the ghost of a woman with shoulder-length hair. Her right hand was slanted to the ground, and she was holding a slender elven sword. The tip of the sword was still trembling slightly. The soul of the Holy Seal. Coden, who was on the other side of the air wall, looked at the woman. At first he was stunned, but then he became suspicious. Who is this woman? Of course he knew her origin, but this soul of the Holy Seal was not one he was familiar with. Coden's own soul was Wind Slayer Sola, and Tobuza's soul was Azure Swordsman Grice. He did not expect that the old man's grandson's soul of the Holy Seal was a woman. Although there were a few women among the 24 knights, their swordsmanship was not suitable for men. Except for Wind Slayer Sola, but Sola's main weapon was a bow, and all the descriptions of her appearance were that she had a ponytail and a long cloak. Obviously this was not the one in front of him. But what surprised him was that this soul of the Holy Seal could actually materialize. What kind of characteristic was this? Although his and Tob's soul imprints could also appear in front of others, as spiritual entities, they could not physically interact with this world. What did he see? He saw that the woman had exchanged 10 swords with Tobuz. He couldn't help but raise his head to look at the arena, wondering if the imprinted spirits were stronger in this half-fantasy space than in the outside world. But this kid's luck isn't too good. He actually picked a soul imprint. Coden was surprised, but at the same time, this thought flashed through his mind, and confirmed that this was indeed the first time Brendel activated a soul imprint. What he found hard to believe was that this young man had already reached this stage without even activating his sealed spirit. If so, then what was the limit of his future achievements? Coden could not comment. Little guy, this is the second time I've saved you. When the woman spoke, her voice was very beautiful, with a mature and rational tone. She did not turn her head, but her voice alone gave people the impression that she was an extremely beautiful woman with an outstanding temperament. Who are you? Brando was stunned. Ever since he transmigrated, he did not know that he had a third spirit-sealed soul. I'll tell you later, the woman replied. You've improved very quickly, but it's still not enough to deal with these enemies. Let me borrow your body. Borrow your body? Brando's heart skipped a beat when he heard this suggestive sentence. He knew that these spirits, or rather, the innate ability of banshees, possessed people. He hurriedly retreated, but the woman waved at him. His body moved forward uncontrollably, allowing the woman's spirit to merge with his body. Don't be afraid, the woman's voice sounded in his mind. Focus on the ring on your finger. You. Brando's eyes widened. Only now did he realize that the woman's spirit might have come from the ring on his finger. He suddenly remembered that Coden had shouted at him outside, telling him that the ring on his finger was the real deal. But the real ring of the Wind Empress? Saint Tassol's divine artifact, the breath of the Wind Empress? How is this possible? Let's not talk about why his grandfather would have such an artifact. Legend has it that the breath of the Wind Empress was a sacred artifact from the wind element. If the mountain of ceasing storms was a mountain peak, then the ring of the Wind Empress would be the most dazzling jewel on the mountain peak. With it, he could control the power of the wind. But what does this have to do with souls? And what does it have to do with this woman? While he was distracted, not far away, his grandfather was repairing the sword in his hand. A layer of faint shadow grew from the broken part of the sword, and then this layer of shadow extended forward, gradually forming the shape of a blade. Then the shadow receded, revealing the bright silver metal blade below. Kid, don't be distracted. When the woman saw this, she immediately reminded him, we can only maintain this state for a short period of time. This is not the correct way to use the Holy Seal. The correct way to use the Holy Seal? Brando was stunned. The Holy Seal was created to pass on its legacy. But now, I'm using my own power to forcibly transfer this legacy to you, the woman replied. You'll understand in the future. Brando shook his head. His mind was in a mess. He could not accept all the information that was coming to him. But of course he understood his current situation. After hearing the woman's words, he immediately scanned his hand. The Ring of the Wind Empress was still the same Ring of the Wind Empress, Ring of the Wind Empress, ring, +1 dexterity. Skill, wind bullet, but at this moment there was a row of small green words, Soul Seal Enlightened State, Soul Seal? Brando frowned slightly. What does that mean? He had heard this term from Coden before, but until now he still did not understand what this so-called Soul Seal was. But at this moment the young man's eyes twitched slightly. He noticed that at the edge of his vision, there were two small notifications, Possession Status, Skill Connection Status. He understood the possession status. All players who were possessed by ghosts would see this notification. It was similar to a debuff notification, to prevent players from not knowing what was happening to them. But the second skill connection status puzzled him. He knew about this status as well. Wizards had a type of spell called ritual spells, which used the power of a magic array to connect the mana pools of many people together to cast a large-scale spell that one person couldn't cast alone. When wizards entered the ritual, they would receive this notification and be able to use other people's spells. But he was not a wizard, so what did this notification mean? Brando's heart skipped a beat, and he unconsciously opened his skill panel. However, it would have been better if he hadn't seen it. The moment he saw it, he was almost scared out of his wits. Originally, he was a civilian with two main professions, militia and mercenary, warrior, elementalist, and a secondary profession, scholar. He only had a few skills such as swordsmanship, equestrian, and elemental sensing. But now there were three new professions on the panel. Swordsman, Seal Knight. Swordsman and swordsman were not difficult for Brando to understand. The former was a basic profession of warrior and ranger, and the swordsman was the most common advanced profession of this profession. But as for what Seal Knight was, he had never heard of it. Although there were many professions of players, there were only a few that Brando did not know about. But this was not the most important thing. What really made him widen his eyes were the skills that appeared behind those professions. Even after the most basic swordsman, there were at least 10 types of swordsmanship. What is this? Brando was at a loss for a moment. Of course he knew where these skills came from, but was that woman so powerful? So many skills meant a lot of practice and even battle experience. In other words, she had to have so many skills and character experience. Brando recalled that he did not have as many skills as this woman when he was level 80 or 90. Of course, this had to do with the fact that the skill trees of players were relatively simple. Very few players were willing to waste their experience on skills that did not add to their main path. Squandering experience like Brando to level up both warrior and elementalist levels was something that only newbies in the game would do. But even so, this was a little too ridiculous. There were probably less than 20 people in Wond in this era who were so powerful. But in other words, the Ring of the Wind Empress was not a product of this era. Then the identity of the woman was obvious. You are a wind elf? Brando asked in his mind. Shoo. The woman pressed her finger on her plump lips. Although Brando could not see it, he could feel the scene in his heart. Don't be distracted, I will tell you later. Your enemy is coming. Her words made Brando suddenly wake up. Sure enough, he saw the 4 people on the field surrounding him. Do you need my help? Brando looked at the skills and shook his head. He could not use them before, but once he mastered them, he was confident that he would not be weaker than anyone else. A level 130 warrior, even in the era of the War of the Holy Saints, was one of the strongest. The woman was slightly surprised. Kid. At this moment, Coden shouted from outside the wall of air. The old man saw the sealed spirit and Brando fusing into one and knew what had happened. He had experienced the same thing when he was young. In fact, at that time, his mind was filled with so much information that he almost fainted. However, Brando stood there without moving. His face was calm, but he seemed to be slightly distracted. Coden could not help but admire him. The old man knew that the first time a person's soul fused with a sealed spirit, the pain was not something a normal person could endure. But what he did not know was that Brando already had 2 souls in his body. Secondly, his system had absorbed the explosion of information from the beginning. P.S. Seeing that no one trusts me, I am very sad. I'm going to explode. Do you dare to support my broken glass heart? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 315. Kid. Koden patted the air wall. Knowledge and skill were two different things. A person could memorize all the starting stances and attack patterns of a swordsmanship, but that was different from years of personal practice. Koden thought that even if Brando understood all the sword styles, it would still be difficult for him to use them. Koden himself had the same experience, but he had gained a lot of experience from years of practice. He thought that with his advice, Brando might be able to defeat those opponents. So he shouted, "Don't worry about those things in your head, I'll tell you how to use them. Whose sword style did you learn?" But what the old man didn't expect was that Brando didn't even care about him. In fact, the young man was a little annoyed. If it wasn't for Koden's interference, he wouldn't have failed. But he understood that Koden was trying to help him, so he didn't mind it too much. But he wouldn't make the same mistake again. First, it wasn't necessary. Second, the enemies were already in front of him. Similarly, Ebden and Buga were at the front, while his grandfather and Turst were at the back. It seemed like these projections were trying to use the same tactic to force him into a corner. That's a good idea. My body is getting heavier and heavier. This is a sign that my stamina is running out. But this time the situation was a little different. Brando thought for a while and picked out a sword style that was most suitable for his current situation. He wasn't unfamiliar with this sword style. He had a friend who was an expert in this sword style. He had also invested a few levels into it, but it didn't fit his main path, so he gave it up. But the mismatch at that time was unexpectedly suitable for this situation. Brendel shook the tip of his sword slightly, and entered into a very familiar stance. "Kid." The woman's voice surprised him. It was a sword style that he had never seen before, but he was already familiar with it. "What's wrong?" Brando's heart was as calm as still water as he replied from an outsider's point of view. "Your talent in swordsmanship is really enviable. The only one who can match up to you is probably that guy." The woman sighed. Her soft sigh could soften one's heart. Brando didn't know who she was talking about, but judging from the elf's coldness, it might be the Flame King Gretel. As far as he knew, Guilt had been crowned as a genius when he was young. It must be known that in the era of the War of the Holy Saints, when the stars rose together, this title was not as serious as it was now. His thoughts were erratic, but the tip of his sword pointed at the enemy remained motionless. At this moment, Brando had a clear feeling that he had been split into two. A self that was about to face the enemy, and a self that was calmly thinking about everything. The two selves did not interfere with each other, forming a dynamic balance. It was a delicate balance. It felt as if time had been stretched out, and everything around him had become fine and delicate. The flow of his thoughts had slowed down, and the movements of the people around him had slowed down as well. The enemies in the gladiator arena were slowly moving towards him. The audience's eyes followed their movements. Koden slapped the air wall and shouted at him from the other side of the arena. "Kid." The old man shouted, "Listen to me, don't try to be brave. No one can master a new swordsmanship from the start." But before the old swordsman could finish his words, his voice stopped abruptly. Because he saw Brando suddenly move. The young man only waved the sword in his hand slightly, and in the next moment he split into four. It was not a clone technique, but Brando's movements were extremely fast. It was as if there were four Brandos attacking his grandfather, Turst, Buga, and Ebden at the same time. Ding 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 ding. Four crisp sounds rang out in the next moment. Horizontally and vertically, Brando clashed with each of his four opponents, and all five of them took a step back. This time, not only did their attack not achieve their goal, but it also increased Brando's range of movement. This was the Wind Elf swordsmanship. The old man recognized it. Wind dance, but what he could not believe was that the young man was able to use it just like that. It was as if he had practiced it for years. No, it was not as simple as just practice. The old man was an experienced swordsman, and of course he understood what Brando's swordsmanship meant. Battle experience. Koden's hand froze in midair. If his eyes could pop out of their sockets, they would have fallen to the ground by now. Oh my God, Martha. What kind of talent is this? The old man felt a headache coming on, as if his brain was being twisted together. How could there be such an existence in this world? He was not the only one who had this feeling. Brando's four opponents felt it especially. Because their strength was limited to the same level, technique became the key to victory. But now they realized that the young man's swordsmanship had become erratic. It was a complete change. The four of them retreated, but they continued to attack after a slight pause. They were all famous swordsmen, and naturally understood that the only way to defeat Brando was to continue pressuring him and not let him have a chance to breathe. This time the main attacker was Brando's grandfather. He was the strongest of the four, so he naturally had to bear the brunt of the pressure. He placed his sword flat, and the others immediately understood what he meant. Surround and maintain the pressure. It could be said that when the old man did this, he had already given up on waiting for an opportunity to decide the outcome of the battle with a single sword strike. Instead, he had switched to a more secure method that was close to defensive suppression. Although it seemed a little despicable, it was still the best choice. Brando saw this scene and was secretly shocked. He could not help but wonder who his grandfather was. This level of command did not seem like the ability of a veteran. However, with 4 against 1, the side that was more conservative was still the side with more people. Brando's battle had completely shocked everyone outside the arena. Especially in the hearts of the youths, this young lord was probably on par with the legendary god of war. But when the old man placed his sword flat, Brando did the same. However, he did not do so for defense, but for the first stance of a swordsmanship. The Tejas Assault Swordsmanship. When Brando found this swordsmanship in the woman's skill list, he was so surprised that the sword in his hand trembled slightly. Compared to Erwin's military swordsmanship, this was the swordsmanship he was most familiar with as a level 130 warrior. It was also the swordsmanship he used the most. This swordsmanship was later learned by the Northerners and gradually spread. After a few modifications, it was given a new name, the Church's Knight Nation's Assault Swordsmanship. Brando placed his sword flat and thought to himself, "Then I'll show you what swordsmanship is." At that moment, his grandfather was clearly the one in front, but Terst was shocked to see that the first person Brando went for was him. How did he go around him? That was the question everyone had in mind at that moment. Even the white-haired old man turned around in shock, but all he saw was Brando plunging his sword into Terst's throat. "What are you doing?" The old man was stunned. He couldn't help but ask Buga and Ebden with his eyes. Even if Brando went around him, how did Brando manage to kill Terst so easily? However, Buga and Terst only replied with the same innocent look. It was too fast. Before they could react, Brando had already flicked away Terst's sword and pierced the young Viscount's throat. "Little one," the woman looked at the scene with surprise, "that's not my swordsmanship. I modified it." Brando boasted shamelessly. His sword didn't slow down as he replied. Brando moved forward, and Ebden and Buga were like children blocking his path. Even the swordsmanship they were so proud of was like a child's play. The young man's attack was as fast as a dragon, and he broke through the encirclement formed by his grandfather and the two swordsmen in a single turn. When Buga and Ebden tried to turn around to look for Brando, the old man raised an eyebrow and tried to block Brando's attack from behind. However, he immediately realized that it was a trap. Because Brando's sword had split into 3, the old man immediately retreated and swung his sword left and right to deflect Brando's attacks. This time it was Brando's turn to be shocked. He looked at his grandfather in disbelief. Even though he didn't have the support of his body and could only display 10% or 20% of his swordsmanship, everyone here was the same. No one was better than the other. The swordsmanship that his grandfather used to block him was at least at level 60. Brando's jaw dropped. Did that mean his grandfather was an elemental awakener? How was that possible? Thinking about it, he felt that this assumption was too absurd. Would a powerhouse with elemental awakening run to a border province to run a small mill? It wasn't that there was no such thing as a hidden expert, but in Brando's memory, his grandfather had always been a veteran of the November War. That was all. He looked at the old man in front of him and the old man looked back at him. Suddenly, his grandfather's expression changed. "Don't." This was the first time Brando's grandfather's projection spoke because he saw Buga preparing to ambush the young man from behind. Of course, he didn't want to warn Brando. Instead, he wanted to remind him that he was a rapier grandmaster. Unfortunately, it was too late. Buga and Brando passed by each other. To be exact, Buga's headless corpse passed by Brando. No one saw how Brando attacked. "It's just a small trick." The young man looked at his grandfather, and replied, "P.S. Do you think there will be more after today? If you guess correctly, please vote. If you don't, please vote more. That's it." Speaking of which, it seems like there are a lot of students writing doujinshi. If there are students who have written doujinshi, please send them to 179096463@QQ.com. I'll organize them and post them so that all the loving students can share them. Chapter 316. It was 1 against 2, and the two silent corpses in the arena seemed to indicate who was the victor. As expected, Brando quickly used the same trick to kill Ebden. Brando felt a little guilty for killing the White Knight twice. No matter how he looked at it, it was too tragic. However, the White Knight did not feel that way. Its corpse turned into a puff of black smoke and disappeared from the arena. This proved that the undead knight was a part of the arena before it was projected and never existed. The White Knight in history had already died in the mountains outside Fortress Reden, just like the countless nameless corpses in this war. The old man in front of him was the same. Brando looked at his grandfather and raised his sword. The old man nodded and did the same. It was Erwin's military swordsmanship. The grandfather and grandson were going to use this swordsmanship that they were both familiar with to decide the victor. What followed was an intense battle. Brando never thought that his grandfather would be this powerful. Of course, if he knew that Coden did not think that this old man was at his peak, he would probably reevaluate his grandfather. Now he was reevaluating this old man. This old man was a veteran of the November War who held the Candlelight Medal. However, if that was all, perhaps he was only slightly stronger than Captain Martin, but not by much. But at this moment, the strength displayed by this old man had clearly far exceeded this realm. Who is he? Brendel did not know the answer. He took a step back and dodged the old man's sword. Then he turned around and stabbed his sword into the old man's chest with a simple stab. The old man was stunned. He did not expect to fail like this, but in the end he raised his head and looked at Brendel. "Well done, young man," he said. Then he turned into black smoke and disappeared from the arena. Brando knew that it was the projection in his heart talking to him. Perhaps the old man had said the same thing to Brando in the past. But the details of this life had long been buried under the dust of memory. Brando could only recall the memory of the past through the voice in the wind. He maintained the posture of holding the sword with one hand and stabbing forward for a moment before he finally came to his senses. The young man shook his head and calmly returned to the center of the field. The wall of air around him disappeared in an instant, and Coden almost fell to the ground. Fortunately, he did not forget about his own strength. He pushed himself up with one hand on the ground. The old swordsman cursed in his heart, but he forgot to ask Brando about his grandfather and the spirit seal. "Looks like it's not a coincidence that you can wake me up." Brando was silent for a while. The woman's voice sounded in his heart again. "It seems that you can wake me up. It's not a coincidence, little guy. Your talent in swordsmanship can't be described as extraordinary." The woman's voice made Brando's ears itch. It was as if he wanted her to say more. "Now can you tell me who you are?" Brando asked. "My name is Orthless." The woman left his body and reappeared in front of him in the form of a ghost. This was the first time he saw the woman's appearance. Her wavy black hair was draped over her shoulders, but it was not messy. Instead, it had a neat and concise power. Her eyes were the unique purple blue of the wind elves, but they were much deeper than the average person's eyes. His first impression of her was that she was a dignified and serious person, but this hint of devilishness made her look more mature than she actually was. She had a long purplish-black eyeshadow, and he could not help but be slightly taken aback. His first impression of her was that she was a dignified and serious person, but this hint of devilishness made her look even more mature. He felt his breath catch in his throat. In the era of the War of the Holy Saints, there were indeed records of mist elves who liked to use facial tattoos to decorate themselves. But this was the first time Brando saw one that was so perfect. "Wait, you are one of the 24 knights." Then he reacted and immediately interrupted her. He had already guessed that she was a heroic spirit from the era of the War of the Holy Saints. But the 24 knights of Saint All the Wind Empress were different. The 24 knights who followed Saint All the Wind Empress were in fact the most outstanding heroes of the elven race. Of course, at that time they were not called Wind Elves, but the Mist Elves, a race that was as famous as the Silver Elves. But these heroes had already fallen in the battle with the Dark Dragon. The last one to sacrifice was the Blade Knight, Orthless. She was also the founder of this profession. That was when the forces of justice were about to win and everyone saw the light at the end of the tunnel. In the Battle of the Grey Swamp, the youngest of the 24 knights, as well as the favorite disciple of Holy Archer Sonia, died in her own position in order to protect the Flame King's attack. In human age, she was only 16 years old. But Brando could not help but feel doubtful when he saw this woman who was holding a sword with one hand and had an outstanding temperament. Could it be that after becoming a heroic spirit, one's age would increase? Otherwise, how could she become so much more mature? "Don't interrupt, little one." Orthless put her finger to her lips with a slight smile in her eyes. "Yes, I am that Orthless. But you can just call me Kaya, that's my nickname." I thought. Brando looked at the woman curiously. I didn't think that you didn't disappear, but became heroic spirits instead. Heroic spirits could not be created out of thin air, unless it was in a place like the sanctum that had some of the attributes of the heroic spirit palace. For example, the Crimson Palace of the Holy Cathedral of Fire that nurtured the flame-beloved knight. But it was rare for a ring to have the ability of a sanctum. This only meant that the Ring of the Wind Empress was worthy of being called a divine artifact. He paused for a moment and suddenly thought of something. What's a sealed spirit? Orthless nodded. Sealed spirit is the abbreviation for the soul of the Holy Seal. The Holy Seal is the Holy Seal of the Wind Empress. There are also the Holy Seal of Fire and the Holy Seal of the Earth. In our era, powerful souls are extremely precious. These unyielding and pure souls are also the best soldiers to fight against the Dark Dragon. The heroic spirit army? Brando tried to ask. Orthless nodded again. It doesn't matter if it's the Wind Empress or the Flame King. The power of the Holy Seal is actually the power of inheritance. This power comes from the dragon race. It's the same for the wise ones themselves. She looked at Brando. That was a cruel war. You'll understand if you experience it yourself. Brando naturally understood the cruelty of the War of the Holy Saints. He even thought of the Silver Elf souls in the Chablis Mountains. They had also become heroic spirits and continued to fight against the Dark Dragon, even under Martha's orders. However, he was curious. This heroic spirit army was not mentioned in most of the history books. It was not even Orthless who told him about it. He had never even heard of it. Where did they go after that? Brando suddenly thought of a possibility. After the war, the 100 races established their own kingdoms. What happened to these heroic spirits? Did they return to the embrace of Mother Earth? The youth thought that the possibility of this was very small. Based on the Silver Elves' heroic spirits in Chablis, most of them might still be in this world. Orthless shook her head as expected. I don't know about that. Brando looked at her. This answer was not out of his expectations. Orthless sacrificed herself on the battlefield before the war ended, so it was normal for her not to know what happened after that. However, he did not care too much about this matter at the moment. It was already difficult for him to gain a foothold in the Erewhon Empire, so he did not have the time to care about these vague historical issues. Orthless did not seem to want to continue on this topic, so she continued, the so-called Soul Seal is because the power of inheritance is indestructible. The Wind Empress divided the Divine Ring into 24 subrings, and placed each of our souls into the subrings. We signed a contract with Lady Martha, and the purpose of our existence is to nurture the next generation of heroes for the forces of justice. For example, you and other youths with talents like you. But the war is already over, Brando replied. Besides, won't you regret being trapped in the ring forever? We have no choice. Orthless replied, if there are no sacrifices, the Dark Dragon will never be defeated. As for the latter, in different eras, who can tell when the fire of war will be extinguished? We can only do our best to ensure the continuation of our civilization. Brando was silent. Compared to the nobles of this era, the sages of the War of the Holy Saints could indeed be called sages. However, this seemed to be a common problem of intelligent races. Once life was easy, civilization would become lazy and hate work. Then, Lady Orthless, what can you do? Will you let me use your skills like before? I'm afraid not. Orthless shook her head. That's just a temporary measure. I can only teach you what I know. It's just a process of accumulation over time. It's impossible to reach the sky in a single step, little one. Brendel looked at her, and her explanation was more acceptable to him. In other words, the so-called power of the soul of the Holy Seal was to develop the talent of a person with potential as much as possible. With these heroic spirits from the War of the Holy Saints as their teachers, the speed of growth of a person with talent was self-evident. But in the end, one still had to rely on oneself. Brando thought that his grandfather and Coden had their own Holy Seal, but now it seemed that the difference between their achievements was like heaven and earth. Although Coden was a mid-gold ranked swordsman, he was only average if the power of the Holy Seal was taken into account. He thought for a moment and asked his last question. Last question, Lady Orthless, you said that this was the second time you saved me. What did that mean? Orthless looked at him and smiled. Have you forgotten about the fire in Bucci, little one? Brando was stunned for a moment, but then he understood. He stared at her with wide eyes. He could not help but feel a burst of fear. If he did not find the Ring of the Wind Empress, he might have died in the red pine forest behind his ancestral home. P.S. I've finally finished writing. To fall heroically, this is the fate of a warrior. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 317. Right now there's only one elevator in area A03 that can be used, but Mr. Odom, are you sure you want to go down? The foreman asked, his eyes darting between the dwarf and the Roman. He brought Odom deep into the mine's tunnel, and there were more than 10 soldiers following behind them. Perkins was scared out of his wits by Coden's disappearance, and Odom was his only hope. When the old dwarf appeared in front of him and asked him to take a look at the mines, he was overjoyed. As for the Roman, the clerk, who seemed to be grasping at straws, did not notice that there was such a person beside the old dwarf. Moreover, this dwarf was going to save him from the fire and water. As for whether the dwarf was willing to take his illegitimate daughter down, that was his freedom, wasn't it? Odom snorted when he heard the foreman's question. Nonsense, why else would I be here? He turned around and looked at the soldiers who were trembling in fear. It was obvious that the rumors about the mine had scared them out of their wits. If you don't want to go down, you can stay up here. The soldiers sighed in relief. But what if the Lord asks? Someone asked. What does that have to do with me? If it wasn't for the fact that it would be troublesome to bring these soldiers with him, he wouldn't have wanted to go into the mines alone. Who knew if the rumors about the monsters were true? There were so many people who had witnessed the monsters, so it might be true. Although the old dwarf had some skills, he wasn't that good at it. You can go and explain yourselves. Don't you know how to lie? It's not like I'm going to expose you. The soldiers nodded in agreement. You're truly a good man, Mr. Odom. They all said in unison. The group quickly came to the elevator and Romaine looked at it from left to right. If there weren't so many people around, she might have touched it out of curiosity. But the dwarf had already pulled her up while she was hesitating. The foreman did not follow them this time. Mr. Odom, I won't be sending you off. Be careful. The dwarf snorted. Of course. You humans are so cowardly. Everyone's expression turned strange, and only the foreman was a little more restrained. He awkwardly asked, Mr. Odom, you know how to operate this machine, right? Nonsense. The old dwarf angrily pulled down a few levers, and the elevator immediately rumbled to life. It slowly descended to the lower level and soon the foreman and the soldiers were left on the upper level. As the elevator sank, the surrounding scenery became a rapidly descending rock wall, and the air became dry and hot. When there were no outsiders around, the Roman became lively and active. She tried to touch the rocks around her. But she was pulled back by the dwarf and he glared at her. Do you want to die? I'm sorry. Romaine apologized in the shortest time in human history. It was at this moment that the elevator landed on the rock layer below and stopped, causing the two of them to sway. The old dwarf raised his torch and looked around. The fourth floor of the mine was as narrow as ever. He thought for a moment and then extinguished the torch. But he immediately noticed a problem. He did not bring any illumination crystals. Of course, he could still bring the Roman back to the first floor to chase after those people. They must have something similar on them, but Odom snorted. He could not bring himself to do that. Moreover, dwarfs could see in the dark, so he decided to continue moving forward. It's dark. The girl's voice came from the darkness, and her eyes were bright in the darkness. Shoo. Odom sniffed. After entering the fourth floor, the air became thinner, and he did not dare to use any flames. Just follow me. The dwarf said. Why don't we have any illumination? The Roman asked. That's because we're underground. Underground air is precious. Illumination crystals? We don't have that, but it's so dark. There's nothing we can do about it. The Roman wants light. Lower your voice. The old dwarf's words were suddenly stuck in his throat because he suddenly felt a soft light shining from behind him, brightening up the surroundings. He rubbed his eyes, thinking that it was just an illusion. The dwarf's eyes widened, and he turned around to see the Roman raising her hand. Her palm was emitting a gentle white light. How did this come about? Odom stuttered. I don't know either. The Roman looked at her palm. It can shine on its own. It's quite interesting. You don't know either? Odom thought that the dwarf was making fun of him. Yes, the Roman nodded obediently. I was thinking that it would be great if there was light. It lit up, isn't it? Is this the first time? Yes. The dwarf touched the Roman's forehead. What's wrong? Nothing, Odom shook his head. I heard that there's a group of people who are ostracized by witches and wizards. They have magical blood flowing through their veins. He paused for a moment. Is your family the same as you? The Roman thought for a moment. Brando said that my aunt is a witch. Which? Odom's eyes widened. Impossible. Witches and that are enemies, unless she's not your real aunt. Were you adopted? My aunt is my aunt, Romain said angrily. Odom raised his eyebrows. What does a dwarf like me have to do with other people's family matters? He suddenly felt that ever since he met this little girl, he seemed to have more and more problems. He scratched his head and replied, "All right, it's good to have a light. Follow me closely. Don't get lost here alone. This is not a joke, all right?" The Roman nodded obediently. But her obedience only lasted for a few seconds before she asked curiously, "What's that, old man?" Odom was startled and turned around subconsciously. Orthlis's words reminded Brendel of the night when the War of the Black Roses broke out, and everything that happened in Bucci. At that time he was just an ordinary young man in this world. He was surrounded by the undead and it took him a lot of effort to escape with the Roman. But what happened that night was not as simple as it seemed. He touched his chest as if he could still feel the pain of being stabbed by the undead. When he was rescued by Freya and her militia from the Red Pine Forest, most of the fatal wounds on his body had healed. He thought that it was an additional effect of the unyielding talent. But now it seemed that the one who saved his life was Orthlis. He looked at her and she nodded. "Thank you," he replied. "No need, little one," Orthlis smiled. "I'm your holy seal spirit. Saving you is helping myself. I don't want to go back to sleep for such a long time." Brando's heart skipped a beat when he heard this. Does that mean that Orthlis will help me whenever I'm in danger? If that's the case, then the previous few dangerous situations did not seem to be a problem at all. It was just that it was not the most dangerous time yet. Orthlis was a knight who followed the Wind Empress Saint Tassel. Although Brando had spent most of his time in the game and did not know much about the legendary King of the North, the Elven King Delu was someone who was as famous as the Flame King Gretel. Presumably, the Flame King's followers were at least at the peak of the elemental realm, and the 24 Knights of the Wind Empress would not be too weak. Brando felt a sense of satisfaction when he thought about having an NPC who was at least level 80 protecting him. He remembered that there was a quest in the Amber Sword where he had to escort a wizard from the Tower of Stars and Moon to investigate a forest that had been distorted by magic. In that quest, it was actually a low-level player working with a high-level NPC. The feeling of being led by an NPC was still fresh in his mind. It was the only time he enjoyed the thrill of crushing a dungeon of the same level. Brando could not help but sneak a glance at Orthlis. He didn't expect her to see right through him. The elf woman had seen through his thoughts. She closed her eyes and said solemnly, "But even so, the Holy Seal spirit has been stripped of its power. Other than the inheritance of swordsmanship and some secret techniques, I don't have much power. Don't expect too much, little one." Ha! Brendel's little scheme was exposed and he felt extremely embarrassed, his face flushed red. But at the same time he felt that it was a pity. Orthlis continued, "In the end, the Holy Seal spirit only represents the power of inheritance. In fact, there are a total of 4 rings that have been lost to the human world. Your grandfather was able to obtain them because we owe your ancestors a favor." Ancestors? Orthlis did not want to talk about this. Brando was not embarrassed this time. It was not the first time he had been rejected by NPCs in the game. This was especially true when it came to legendary existences. They were very tight-lipped, and if he did not meet the necessary conditions, he would not be able to get anything useful out of them. But at least Brando knew that his grandfather was hiding something from him and Brando's father. This was very similar to what he had guessed. His grandfather was not only a noble, but his identity was also not simple. But he did not ask. Because at this time, a row of text appeared in his vision, urging him to choose his reward. He had wasted too much time talking with Orthlis. The atmosphere in the arena was beginning to change, and the host did not give the challengers much time to prepare. If he did not make a decision quickly, his opponent would probably start the next challenge. He saw that Medisha had come to his side again. It seemed that this elven girl thought that he was going to start the next challenge. The surroundings were also quiet. Coden seemed to be thinking about something, and the youths were looking forward to it. "Everyone, please don't get too worked up. If you meet some people who scold you for no reason when you write a book, you'll be in a bad mood. Authors are also human beings, social animals, and they don't exist outside of society, okay? I also want to stay at home and write my book, not caring about anything, and have someone deliver food to me every day. But is that possible? When I write a book, I value perfection. If I can't write a book that I am not satisfied with, then I will get stuck. Do you think I am willing to do this? If I can't update it, then all you have to do is read less. What do I lose? Money, fame, friends, and a lot more. Just to be clear, this book does not have any chapters in stock and I can't keep any. I will publish as much as I can every day, and I will publish as many chapters as I can. Everyone is welcome to give your opinions, but please don't criticize me for no reason. I have my pride and tolerance. If you don't like this book, then you can choose not to read it. For example, some people from LK. If you don't like this book, then please read the monthly chapters. As long as there is no lag, this book will not be slow. Even last month, I updated about 50 chapters, and the fastest I updated was about 90 chapters a month. I personally think that this speed is very fast. That's all for now. As usual, please support me if you're satisfied with this book. I'll try my best to make up for yesterday's book today. Chapter 318. What language is this? This time it was Medicia's turn to ask. There's an ancient saying, the one who wields this sword is the master of the earth. Brendel replied with a strange feeling in his heart. My lord, you know ancient proverb? This time the silver elf was surprised. Not only her, but even Orthless was taken aback. Ancient proverb was a language that existed before the ancient era. It was even older than the history of the Twilight Dragon. In other words, the background of the game was meaningless. Just like the background of the distant mountains, it could only be seen from afar. It had nothing to do with the era the players lived in. Brando coughed and realized his mistake. He hurriedly replied, I've seen some of it in the ancient books of the Black Tower, but I think the craftsmen of Buga should have more records. Medicia nodded, but Orthless looked at him suspiciously. Brando felt guilty and did not look at the two of them. He could not wait to check the attributes of Haurangaya. Although he had heard of the name of this sword before, it was impossible for him to have the opportunity to own it. As a level 45 fantasy grade sword, the price of this sword was astronomical. Brando did not even dare to think about it. But even though he was mentally prepared, he could not help but be shocked when he looked at its attributes. Halangia, gold, 34-42 hardness/sharpness, plus 22 strength, plus 17 dexterity, plus 20 vitality. Additional skills. Earthquake, automatically cast a rock fang thrust in the direction of the sword wielder's attack. The strength depends on the wielder's strength. Elemental Lord, the wielder can summon 6 obsidian leopards to fight for him. Stone Nest, consumes gray crystal to produce obsidian leopards at the rate of 1 day, capacity 10300. This ability can be turned off automatically. Nest upgrade, obsidian leopard. Required materials, magic black crystal, stone key, sage slate, amberstone X6. When Brando saw this thing, he couldn't help but curse in his heart. First of all, the 34-42 damage was far superior to other weapons of the same level. It seemed that the Haurangaya should have some additional attack, because even other fantasy longswords of the same level were at least a third inferior to it in terms of damage. Although Brando already knew about the Earthquake and Elemental Lord's abilities, the attributes of the stone burrow stunned him. At that moment, his mind was filled with only one word: mobile nest. As everyone knew, there were all kinds of lairs in the world of Wond. Some equipment could even produce magical creatures on a regular basis. These things were known as mobile lairs among the players. Brando had seen similar things before, and the ring on his hand was one of them. However, the ring of the Wind Empress was obviously much more powerful. Compared to injecting the nest rules into magical equipment, it was obviously much more difficult to make the equipment possess the Holy Land attribute. But what really shocked Brando was that this nest could be upgraded. Normally, a primitive nest could be upgraded twice. Even if this stone burrow was upgraded once, the next level of obsidian leopard would at least have the strength of a pinnacle iron-ranked creature. If he could control this thing for a year, wouldn't he have at least 300 pinnacle iron-ranked creatures under his command? What if this nest was still in its primitive state? What if this nest was a special nest, and not only could it be upgraded twice? Brando felt extremely excited just thinking about it. Even the corner of his mouth twitched unconsciously. However, he immediately had a new problem. Upgrading things was not easy. The magic black crystal was still fine. With Master Alchemist Tamar here, Brando wasn't worried that he couldn't create it. The raw materials for this nest were the black crystal and mana essence, which were not difficult to obtain. As for the sage slate, Brando felt a headache whenever he saw it. The adventure in Chablis had left him with a psychological trauma. Fortunately, it could still be bought from the market. He would soon go to Ampere Seal, and in that bustling free port, it shouldn't be difficult to obtain a sage slate. The last two items were more troublesome. Amber ores were regulated products in any country. It was the source of power for magicite. There were actually 2 names for these ores. The second one was called Somir ores, and the purest ores were called amber ores. Brando wanted to prepare a magicite workshop for Amandina, but he had to think of a way to secretly obtain Somir ores. Moreover, this was difficult, so where was he going to get these amber ores? Brando could only think of mining by himself. There were many mines that had not been discovered in this era, but they were all in the wilderness, and he did not have the ability to do so for the time being. As for the stone key, it was even more complicated. There were many things in the elemental realm, but mortals were unable to enter the elemental realm, so there were very few of them in the prime material plane. Brando felt that it was more appropriate to describe the rarity of this item in the game. This item was necessary for a player's guild to build a city and become a lord. He patted his head, feeling a headache coming on. But it was at this moment that the loud voice rang out again. "Mortal, are you ready for the next challenge?" The voice was deafening and it drowned out all other sounds in the arena. Everyone fell silent, and their attention shifted away from the sword in Brando's hand. Only then did they remember that they were still in this strange arena. Of course not. Brando was about to reply, but a voice stopped him at this moment. "Sir." He was very familiar with this voice. It was the voice of the skinny youth called Cohen. He turned his head and saw that the youths were still locked in the cages. Even though Cohen had rescued some of them, at least half of them were still locked in the cages. Brando looked at the skinny youth and guessed why he called out to him. But he did not intend to agree. First of all, he knew his own strength, and there was no way he could pass the sixth challenge. Rashly accepting the challenge would only result in failure. Secondly, he vaguely guessed that the appearance of the sanctuary had something to do with these youths. He had to admit that these youths were very brave. They knew that there was something strange in the mine, and yet they still dared to act recklessly. But since they had made a choice, they had to take responsibility for their actions. Their actions had even implicated others. Not to mention how many miners had died in the landslide. If he was not strong enough, he, Yuta, Scarlet, and Medisha would have all been trapped here. Even though Brando did not think that there was anything wrong with a person being compassionate, he had his own principles. A woman's benevolence did not equate to true benevolence. Thus, he shook his head and rejected the other party's suggestion before the other party could continue. He waved to Orthless and Medisha and led them out of the arena. "Wait," Cohen called out again. "Sir, I'm not asking for your sympathy," the youth shouted from the cage. This time Brando paused and stopped. "I want to make a deal with you," the youth said. "Sir, you can choose to agree or not. The choice is in your hands. But can you please let me state my conditions?" Brando looked up at the sky. The arena of destiny was very human-like. The host seemed to have seen everything below, and the voice from above did not appear again. "Speak." The youth thought for a moment and nodded. He was a little curious. What kind of deal could these poor and penniless youths have with him? Even if they were willing to work for him, what could they do? These youths were not strong and they were just miners. Brando did not mind accepting a few followers, but the price was too high. He looked at the youth and suddenly remembered that he had eavesdropped on their conversation on the way here. Mar seemed to have mentioned that the youth had something strange and worthless on him. Could it be that? Brando frowned. To be honest, he was not optimistic about this deal. He knew that some NPCs liked to collect strange trinkets just like the little Roman. But those things were not valuable and he had been tricked a few times in the game. However, the youth still had patience. He stood there and waited for the youth to take out the item. Cohen rummaged in his chest for a while and took out something that Brando did not expect. It was a card of fate. Brando's expression turned strange. He did not expect Cohen to have something like this. This was exactly what he wanted. Brando, who had received many surprises and benefits from being a planeswalker, was now very interested in the card of fate. Even though he knew that there was no hope for him to complete the sixth challenge, he could not help but be tempted when he saw the card. It was like a collector who saw something good that moved him. He saw that it was a fire card and the item on the card made his heart beat faster. Fireclaw Lord, Fire Tribe I. 20 Fire, Creature, Fireclaw Lizard Warrior, Level 33 Elite, Warlike. When the Fireclaw Lord is on the field, all Fireclaw tribesmen on the field gain 1 battle counter. Pay 1 fire. All Fireclaw tribesmen on the field gain the ability Charge. When the Fireclaw Lord is on the field, pay 1 wealth and 1 reputation per day. The Lord is the best commander of the Infernal Legion. Brando did not know what the battle counter was, but after experiencing the battle counter, he knew that it was something that would buff a summoned creature. Furthermore, the card itself was a level 33 elite, which meant that it was a gold tier summoned creature. Not to mention, it could provide the Fireclaw tribesman with the ability Charge. This was a fatal blow to Brando. He happened to have a Fireclaw tribesman card in his possession, and according to the Shire, this card set was something that could only be found by chance. Of course, he understood the young man's intention. But should he continue the challenge? There was almost no chance of winning the sixth challenge, but Brando was not willing to give up. He could not help but be stuck in a dilemma. "My lord," Medisha said, "that is a silver card. Pay attention to its serial number, it should be the core card of the Fire Tribe." Brando was stunned. He only just noticed that the Fireclaw Lord's serial number was I, and cards with serial number I were usually the core cards of the set. This was something that the Shire and Medisha had told him before. This made him even more troubled. P.S. Today I saw a very philosophical sentence, so I want to share it with everyone. Regarding the conclusion of Renren.net, go to Renren, go to your classmates, go to your classmates, go to Renren. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 319. But Brando knew that he would not be able to proceed to the next round. Although it was a pleasant surprise that he did not meet the Mithril Sage in the 5th round, it did not mean that the next round would be easy. The 6th round would undoubtedly be a battle between elementals, and Brando did not even need to think about it. Orthlis had already stated that she could not help him, and this time he did not have the heroic spirits of the Silver Elves by his side, nor did he have a female dragon to help him. In a battle between elementals, it did not matter if it was him, Medisha, or the 2 clones of the Shire that he created with the Sphere of Eternity. Even if Scarlet recovered her strength and joined the battle, she would not have a chance of winning. The difference between the 2 levels was too obvious. That was why Scarlet could not even withstand a single blow from the Angel of the Earth. Therefore, Brando did not think for too long and immediately accepted the system's request. The roulette once again appeared in front of him. He tapped it with his finger and the needle quickly began to spin. However, when it slowed down, it once again passed the blood-stained altar, and stopped on a card named Myriad Phenomena Forest. Damn. Brando cursed. It seemed that his luck was as bad as always. He could not help but wish that Softu was here. But it was not the time to summon Falerne. There were also a lot of things waiting for them to deal with in Abies. He stretched out his palm and let the gray non-attribute card fall into his hand. On the surface of the card was written as follows: Vientiane Forest, Myriad Wonders 3, 30 any treasure, Sanctum Fantasy, attach. Add 3 equipment counters to target creature, Dwarf, Kurlutzian. The Dwarf's treasure vault, dazzling gold. When the card fell, Orthlis saw it too. The elven woman's purplish-blue eyes flashed, but she thought for a moment and did not say anything. Brando's mind was focused on the card in his hand, and naturally did not notice the reaction of the Holy Seal's spirit. Instead, he asked the others in his mind when he received the card. "What is the meaning of this counter? My lord, did you get something good again?" A slightly relaxed voice sounded in his mind. It was the Shire's voice. Brando was surprised. The Shire was still in Abies. He quickly asked, "You can hear me?" "Of course." The Shire shrugged his shoulders in Brando's mind. "I'm the main card, Medisha and the Nightsong Tiger should be able to hear me." "My lord, you didn't specify who to ask that question." "There's no limit to the distance between a planeswalker and a summoned creature?" "How's the situation on your side?" Brendel asked. "What's the situation on your side?" My lord, why don't you guess?" Charles purposely kept him in suspense. "There's a guy here who's full of doubts about your identity. He's waiting for you to come back and educate him." "There's a guy waiting for me to teach him a lesson?" Brando was secretly puzzled by the Shire's words, but he was never one to let others lead the conversation. He simply ignored the Shire's actions and asked, "Then, can someone explain to me what this thing is?" He pointed at the card in his hand. "Equipment counters are used to strengthen a card's combat power. My lord, is the card in your hand a bronze or silver card?" Seal did not mind Brendel dropping the topic. The two of them had a tacit understanding between them. "Bronze," Brando replied. "Bronze equipment counters, each one can increase a summoned creature's natural level by about 5. This was Medisha's voice. The silver elf girl was sent out of the arena by the previous rules, and she was now opposite Coden. "What's a natural level?" Brando asked again. "The natural level should be the level of the summoned creature on the card." The Shire replied. "Level on the card?" Brando's heart skipped a beat. It seemed that the cards of fate were the only item in this world that mentioned a creature's level. In many places, whether it was this era or the Dark Ages, people were already used to using the realm to determine the strength of a creature. Gold realm, silver realm, or elemental activation, but there was never a mention of a certain person's level. This was because it was more like a term used in the game. Brando was suddenly awakened. He could not help but look at the card in his hand. For the first time, he wondered if this thing had anything to do with his arrival in this world. He had never seen something like the cards of fate in the game. Even though the cards of fate would become part of the rules after being unsealed, and only the summoner could see them, what about the unsealed cards? But he knew that now was not the time to think about this. He suppressed his doubts and thought of another card he had. It was the golden battle flag, which also increased a creature's natural level. But Brando had not used that card since he got it. Because the golden battle flag could only increase the level of all his summoned creatures on the field by 1 level, he had to pay 5 light EP for it. Not to mention that he was already lacking in light EP, the significance of this thing was not that great. What was the use of 1 level for a summoned creature? Of course, perhaps in the future when he could maintain a large number of summoned creatures on the field, this 1 level might become more significant, but at least not now. Now it seemed that this nature's collection was much more useful than the golden battle flag. Thinking of this, he turned the card over and asked, "The Shire, can you use this card?" According to the requirements of the card, Medisha as an elf naturally could not, but the Shire was a human. "You have to show me the card, my lord," the Shire replied. Brando immediately read the card in his mind. After about a few seconds, the young wizard opposite him shook his head. "I can't, my lord." "Why not?" Brando asked in surprise. "I'm a Highland wizard, my lord. Our branch is divided from the Silver Alliance. Even though we have mixed blood with the Erewhon people for generations, we are still descendants of the Buga people." "I see." Brando let the card disappear from his hand and felt a little regretful. "Then I'll have to put this card aside for now." "No." Medisha replied, "My lord, there are people in your card who can use it." "Oh." The young man was stunned. "The Nightsong Tiger and his people." "Wait," Brando was stunned. "Furlern and Tia are wild elves, and there are also barbarians and Highlanders among the mercenaries of Lopez." "Medisha is right, my lord," the Shire spoke. "The Nightsong Tiger is the main card. The Nightsong Tiger is a Lopez person, and the Lopez people are also a branch of the Cruz people. In other words, as long as the main card matches the description of the group summoning card, it's fine?" Brando asked. "Yes." Brando was relieved. The Shire would only be at the pinnacle of gold rank even if he increased his level by 15. However, if the Lopez mercenaries increased their level by 15, they would be at level 30, and they would be on the verge of breaking through to silver rank. This difference in strength was huge, and it meant that he had a team of generals under his command. That was not bad. He snapped out of his thoughts and looked up to see Orthless staring at him. He could not help but feel a little guilty. Because he had his own small world, he often had to be absent-minded in front of others. It was fine if it happened once or twice, but if he was always in a daze and others mistook it as a natural attribute, then he would really be embarrassed as a man. Of course, there was no such adjective in this world. However, Brando always felt a little guilty in front of Orthless. Her temperament was similar to his senior, and if she was here, Brando was sure that she would have laughed at him for being a natural airhead. "I'm sorry," he explained, "I thought of a problem." The woman smiled and nodded in understanding. At this time, the loud voice in the arena finally sounded again. "Mortal, you have passed the test. You will receive a reward." Brando looked up and saw the sword in the middle of the arena suddenly vibrate. It broke free from its shackles and flew straight towards Brando. Everyone cried out in surprise, but Brando raised his hand and firmly grasped the hilt of his sword. The sword was trembling in his hand. Brando felt a majestic power rising from the depths of his heart. This power was connected to the earth as if as long as he stood on the earth, he would never fall. The moment he held the sword, the arena suddenly quieted down. Then, in the next moment, all the rune dwarves in the audience cheered together. "Zro! Zro! 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 Zro!" The loud voice hit everyone in the arena, causing them to feel dizzy. But whether it was Koden, Yuta, or even the Utes, they could clearly hear that the voice was not hostile. It was more like it was supporting something. The voice gradually became louder and louder. Brando stood there, holding the sword and bathing in the cheers. He could not help but have a feeling in his heart. It was as if he had been crowned king with the sword in his hand. But he shook his head to get rid of this thought. He turned to Medisha and asked, "What are they talking about?" Zero is the ancient dwarven language. It is actually a person's name, the ancient great emperor of the rune dwarves, Zero. Later, this name was used to refer to all the kings above the great emperor. King? Brando raised the sword in his hand. Indeed, there was a small line of words carved in the ancient language. Because the game designers were lazy, the small amount of words in the so-called ancient language that appeared in the game was actually replaced with words from the real world. The words carved on the sword were English. This made Brando feel very strange when he saw these familiar words. P.S. I feel much better now that I've complained about it. I'll continue to ask for support and apologize to my injured classmates. Chapter 320. What language is this? This time it was Medicia's turn to ask. There's an ancient saying, the one who wields this sword is the master of the earth. Brendel replied with a strange feeling in his heart. My lord, you know ancient proverb? This time the silver elf was surprised. Not only her, but even Orthless was taken aback. Ancient proverb was a language that existed before the ancient era. It was even older than the history of the Twilight Dragon. In other words, the background of the game was meaningless. Just like the background of the distant mountains, it could only be seen from afar. It had nothing to do with the era the players lived in. Brando coughed and realized his mistake. He hurriedly replied, I've seen some of it in the ancient books of the Black Tower, but I think the craftsmen of Buga should have more records. Medicia nodded, but Orthless looked at him suspiciously. Brando felt guilty and did not look at the two of them. He could not wait to check the attributes of Haurangaya. Although he had heard of the name of this sword before, it was impossible for him to have the opportunity to own it. As a level 45 fantasy grade sword, the price of this sword was astronomical. Brando did not even dare to think about it. But even though he was mentally prepared, he could not help but be shocked when he looked at its attributes. Halangia, gold, 34-42 hardness/sharpness, plus 22 strength, plus 17 dexterity, plus 20 vitality. Additional skills. Earthquake, automatically cast a rock fang thrust in the direction of the sword wielder's attack. The strength depends on the wielder's strength. Elemental Lord, the wielder can summon 6 obsidian leopards to fight for him. Stone Nest, consumes gray crystal to produce obsidian leopards at the rate of 1 day, capacity 10300. This ability can be turned off automatically. Nest upgrade, obsidian leopard. Required materials, magic black crystal, stone key, sage slate, amberstone X6. Brando couldn't help but curse in his heart when he saw this thing. First of all, the 34 to 42 points of damage was far superior to other weapons of the same level. It seemed that the Haurangaya should have some additional attack, because even other fantasy longswords of the same level were at least 1/3 less powerful than it in terms of damage. Although Brando already knew about the Earthquake and Elemental Lord's abilities, the attributes of the stone burrow stunned him. At that moment, his mind was filled with only one word: mobile nest. As everyone knew, there were all kinds of lairs in the world of Wond. Some equipment could even produce magical creatures on a regular basis. These things were known as mobile lairs among the players. Brando had seen similar things before, and the ring on his hand was one of them. However, the ring of the Wind Empress was obviously much more powerful. Compared to injecting the nest rules into magical equipment, it was obviously much more difficult to make the equipment possess the Holy Land attribute. But what really shocked Brando was that this nest could be upgraded. Normally, a primitive nest could be upgraded twice. Even if this stone burrow was upgraded once, the next level of obsidian leopard would at least have the strength of a pinnacle iron-ranked creature. If he could control this thing for a year, wouldn't he have at least 300 pinnacle iron-ranked creatures under his command? What if this nest was still in its primitive state? What if this nest was a special nest and not only could it be upgraded twice? Brando was extremely excited when he thought about it, and the corners of his mouth twitched unconsciously. However, he immediately had a new problem. Upgrading things wasn't easy. The magic black crystal was still fine, and with Master Alchemist Tamar here, Brando wasn't worried that he couldn't create it. The raw materials for this nest were the magic essence and the black crystal, so it wasn't difficult to obtain. As for the sage slate, Brando felt a headache whenever he saw it. The adventure in Chablis had left him with a psychological trauma. But at least it could still be bought from the market. He might have to make a trip to Ampere Seal soon, and it shouldn't be difficult to obtain a sage slate in that bustling free port. The last 2 items were troublesome. Amber ores were regulated products in every country, and they were the source of power for magicite. There were actually 2 names for these ores. The second one was called Somir ores, and the purest ores were called amber ores. Brando thought that he could only secretly obtain some Somir ores in order to prepare a magicite workshop for Amandina, and it was difficult to do so. So where was he going to get these amber ores? Brando thought about it and could only think of mining himself. There were many mines that had not been discovered in this era, but they were all in the wilderness, and he did not have the ability to do so in a short period of time. As for the stone key, it was even more complicated. There were many elemental realms, but mortals could not enter the elemental realms, so there were very few of them in the prime material plane. Brando felt that the stone key's rarity could be explained in the game's terms. It was a necessary item for a player's guild to build a city and become a lord. He patted his head and felt a headache coming on. But it was at this moment that the loud voice rang out again. "Mortal, are you ready for the next challenge?" The voice was deafening and it drowned out all the other sounds in the arena. Everyone was silent, and they shifted their attention away from the sword in Brando's hand. Only then did they remember that they were still in this strange arena. Of course not. Brando was about to answer, but a voice stopped him at this time. "Sir." He was very familiar with this voice. It was the voice of the skinny youth called Cohen. He turned his head and saw that the youths were still locked in the cages. Even though Cohen had saved some of them, at least half of them were still locked in the cages. Brando looked at the skinny youth and guessed why he called out to him. But he did not intend to agree. First of all, he knew that he could not pass the sixth challenge. If he accepted it, he would only fail. Secondly, he vaguely guessed that the appearance of the sanctuary had something to do with these youths. Howrin had to admit that these people were really brave. They knew that there was something strange in the mine, and yet they still dared to act recklessly. But since they had made a choice, they had to take responsibility for their actions. Their actions had even implicated others. Not to mention the number of miners who died in the landslide. If Howrin was not strong enough, he, Jana, Scarlet, and Medisa would have been trapped here. Brando did not think that there was anything wrong with a person being compassionate, but he had his own principles. Being soft-hearted did not equate to being merciful. Thus, he shook his head and rejected the other party's suggestion before the other party could continue. He waved to Orthlis and Medisha and led them out of the arena. "Wait," Cohen called out again. "Sir, I'm not asking for your sympathy," the youth shouted from the cage. This time Brando paused and stopped. "I want to make a deal with you," the youth said. "Sir, you can choose to agree or not. The choice is in your hands. But can you let me state my conditions?" Brando looked up at the sky. The arena of destiny was very human-like. The host seemed to have seen everything below, and the voice from above did not appear again. "Speak." The youth thought for a moment and nodded. He was a little curious. What kind of deal could these poor and penniless youths have with him? Even if they were willing to work for him, what could they do? These youths were not strong and they were just miners. Brando did not mind taking in some followers, but the price was too high. He looked at the youth and suddenly remembered that he had eavesdropped on their conversation on the way here. Mar had mentioned that the skinny youth had something strange and worthless on him. Could it be that? Brando frowned. To be honest, he was not optimistic about this deal. He knew that some NPCs liked to collect strange trinkets just like the little Roman. But those things were not valuable and he had been tricked a few times in the game. However, the youth still had patience. He stood there and waited for the youth to take out the item. Cohen rummaged in his chest for a while and took out something that Brando did not expect. It was a card of fate. Brando's expression turned strange. He did not expect Cohen to have something like this. This was exactly what he wanted. Brando, who had received many surprises and benefits from being a planeswalker, was now very interested in the card of fate. Even though he knew that the sixth challenge was hopeless, he could not help but be moved when he saw the card. He was like a collector who saw something good that moved his heart. He saw that it was a fire card, and the item on the card made his heart beat faster. Fireclaw Lord, Fire Tribe I. 20 Fire, Creature, Fireclaw Lizard Warrior, Level 33 Elite, Warlike. When the Fireclaw Lord is on the field, all Fireclaw members on the field gain 1 battle counter. Pay 1 fire. All Fireclaw Spearmen on the field gain the ability Charge. When the Fireclaw Lord is on the field, pay 1 wealth and 1 reputation per day. The Lord is the best commander of the Infernal Legion. Brando did not know what the battle counter was, but after experiencing the battle counter, he knew that it was something that would buff a summoned creature. Furthermore, the card itself was a level 33 elite, which meant that it was a gold tier summoned creature. Not to mention, it could provide the Fireclaw Spearman with the ability Charge. This was a fatal blow to Brando. He happened to have a Fireclaw Spearman card in his possession, and according to the Shire, this card set was something that could only be found by chance. Of course, he understood the young man's intention. But should he continue the challenge? There was almost no chance of winning the sixth challenge, But Brando was not willing to give up. He could not help but be stuck in a dilemma. "My lord," Medisha said, "that is a silver card. Pay attention to its serial number, it should be the core card of the Fire Tribe." Brando was stunned. He only just noticed that the Fire Lord card in the set was I, and cards with the serial number I were usually the core cards of the set. This was something that the Shire and Medisha had told him before. This made him even more troubled. If you want to know what will happen next, please log on to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the legal reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy. Chapter 321. Everyone could see Brando's hesitation. Yuta and Scarlet looked at each other without saying a word. The youths all had nervous looks on their faces. Indeed, the difficulty of every challenge in the arena of destiny was clear to everyone. If it wasn't for the sudden appearance of that woman in the last challenge, everyone knew that the young man would have already failed. As for the next challenge, no one dared to say that they were confident. Brando was the same. Medisha gently pulled him from behind and whispered, "My lord, there are more than one card in this set. If we really can't do it, we can just give up." But he was still hesitant. Vaunt was so big and there were so many cards of fate scattered throughout the world. There were many of them, but the chances of encountering one or two of them were too small. Brando had played games before, and naturally knew that rare equipment like this could only be obtained once. It was a matter of luck, and if he missed it once he might not have another chance. But he was not a reckless person. Even gamblers would stake everything on a single throw to seize that 1 in a million chance. But if he were to walk into the arena again, he might not even have that 1 in a million chance. He thought for a moment and was about to shake his head when he heard a voice, "My lord, let me give it a try." He looked up and saw Scarlet struggling to stand up from the cage. The girl's complexion did not look too good, but she still insisted on frowning. "My lord, I feel that I've recovered some of my strength and I haven't challenged anyone yet. Let me try." Before she could finish, she felt Yuta tugging at her from behind. She could tell that Brando was quite interested in Cohen's offer. She was worried that if Scarlet volunteered, Brando might really agree. For some reason, when Yuta saw Scarlet's weak back, it was as if she saw her own sister standing in front of her. She instinctively did not want Scarlet to take the risk. "Let me go, Yuta." Scarlet blocked Yuta's hand. The female mercenary group leader was stunned. However, Brando shook his head. The first challenge in the arena was against the Cerberus, a silver-ranked Cerberus. Even Yuta was no match for it. What use would a red-haired girl who had recovered some of her strength be? He could tell that Scarlet was at most a silver beginner at this time. "No." Brando answered without much thought, "I can't let you take the risk." But Brando did not intend to pay attention to Scarlet, but no matter how important the cards were, they were not as important as the people around him. Gambling with people's lives, Brando did not have the habit of ignoring life like those nobles. Moreover, if Scarlet was locked in the cage again, would he save her or not? Brando shook his head and rejected Cohen's suggestion. He looked up at Cohen and shook his head regretfully. Then, he looked at the sky above the gladiator arena and was about to reply, Brando, you're here." A voice that no one had expected rang out. The crisp and pleasant voice made Brando's heart beat wildly. Why was she here? He couldn't help but turn around subconsciously. Sure enough, he saw that familiar face, which was also filled with surprise. The merchant girl had her hands on her purse and walked in from the other side of the arena. She was with a dwarf, and Brando recognized the dwarf. He remembered that his name was Odom, and he should be a descendant of the Rune dwarfs. He had seen him once at the Trout in the Forest bar. But why was the Roman with him? Brando's mind was filled with questions. Odom did not pay attention to the people around him. The old dwarf raised his head and looked at the surrounding buildings with his eyes wide open. It was as if he was completely immersed in it. Brendel? Unlike him, Roman's attention was completely focused on Brendel from the start, and he did not even spare a glance at anyone else. The look of surprise on the merchant lady's face quickly turned into a look of deep worry. She blinked and her eyes turned red. In fact, this was the first time Brando saw the Roman showing such worry in her eyes. "I'm so worried, Brando. Aunt isn't here, and if something happens to Brando?" The girl's words softened Brando's heart. He wanted to ask her why she was here, but where were the two angels? Naturally, he could not bring himself to ask that. The Roman lowered her head and put her feet together. She unconsciously tapped her leather shoes against each other. The Roman came here secretly. Brando, are you going to scold me now? Even though she said that, the mischievous girl was still sneaking glances at Brendel from the corner of her eyes, as if she was extremely afraid. Brando could not reprimand her when he saw her like that. Moreover, the Roman did it for his sake. He wanted to teach her a lesson so that she would not run around in the future, but now was not the time. The young man did not know whether to laugh or cry as he shook his head and his complaints disappeared with the wind. But a new problem arose. Logically speaking, anyone who entered this place would have to accept a challenge. With the Roman's strength, there was no way she could pass the challenge. Then who would save her? Brando's scalp went numb. The sixth challenge? But sometimes, the more he worried about something, the faster it would happen. At this moment, the voice from above came unexpectedly. New challenger, do you want to accept the challenge? The Roman looked up in confusion. She turned her head and looked left and right as if trying to find where the voice came from. Little Roman, give up. Brando gritted his teeth and reminded her. No matter what, he could not leave her here alone. This girl was the first person he met when he came to this world. She was also the one who had gone through life and death with him from the very beginning. In his heart she was his partner. To him she had a different meaning than everyone else. Perhaps she was even more important than the Valkyrie in his heart. If the revival of Erwin and the fate of the Valkyrie were a dream in his heart, then the merchant girl had a more real meaning to him. He had always seen her as the link between him and this world. This feeling was even deeper than the feelings he had for Brando's family. The two souls in his body made the word family seem close yet distant. It was as if only his grandfather's old face was the most clear. This was also the reason why he had not considered going back to his home to take a look. Subconsciously he felt that he was unable to face it. But the Roman was different. He promised her that he would protect her and be her knight. So Brando touched his sword. He had to fulfill his promise as a man. If he could not win, he would turn into a stone statue with the Roman. Although he was unwilling to accept this, Brando did not regret it. My lord. As his summoned creature, Medisha was keenly aware of his thoughts. This is my choice. Brando shook his head and smiled, but I will have to trouble Medisha. You will have to stay here for a while. Maybe it will be a long time until the next master finds you. Then the one you summon will not be Medisha. The silver elf girl looked at him quietly and said softly, Medisha only belongs to my lord. Just like the Shire, every planeswalker has their own laws and world. The same card does not represent the same person. Brando's heart skipped a beat. Medisha looked outside and said softly, I think Miss Scarlet is the same. What do you mean? The silver elf princess looked up at him. Her pale silver eyes had a calmness that could see through everything. It was as if the noise of the mortal world had been washed away by her quiet and ethereal eyes. Ever since the Grey Wolves mercenaries disbanded, my lord has been Miss Scarlet's only hope. Haven't you noticed? She asked softly. How can that be? Brando was stunned. Aren't there other members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries? And that eek, if I'm not wrong, she should like him. On Smita, so cares. Medisha replied in an ethereal voice. People need each other. Brando interpreted this ancient silver elf proverb. The silver elf girl nodded. Because you are valued, you will value the person who values you. There are not many people in this world who can truly be your friend, so we will cherish this hard-won mutual understanding. If Miss Scarlet can feel the importance, then so can Medisha. The silver elf princess smiled. I only have an illegitimate child, but by my lord's side, I can feel true respect and courtesy. This is a joy that comes from the heart, and Medisha cherishes it. She smiled and nodded. Thank you, my lord. So please don't feel guilty. Brando nodded and looked at the Roman. The merchant girl clearly did not understand the current situation. She looked at the serious Brando in a daze. What's wrong, Brando? Did the Roman do something wrong? No. Brando shook his head. Compared to doing good with bad intentions, I think doing bad with good intentions is more adorable. He said, because the former can only become worse, while the latter can become better, isn't that right? He drew his sword. The surroundings quieted down. Cohen thought for a moment and kept the item in his hand. He did not say anything more. After experiencing it once, everyone knew the rules here. They obviously understood the situation Brando was in now. That young lady was obviously the one he loved. So how should he choose? As for whether or not they would be saved, Cohen suddenly felt that it wasn't too important at this moment. Because if Brando wanted to save them, he would have to go through the 7th challenge, but that was obviously impossible. Without hope, it would not seem so hopeless. P.S. Everyone, how many chapters can you update in a few days? The encouragement and support from everyone in the book review and comment section is making me cry. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support legal reading. Chapter 322. Cohen put down his hand as if he had thought it through. Mar and Joka looked at him from the side, feeling uncomfortable. After all, Cohen was still their comrade. For the youth, this separation was cruel. They had all thought about it. If Cohen couldn't leave, they would stay. At worst, they wouldn't be able to leave. Mar thought darkly to himself that Brendel might choose to stay behind as well, and he saw the young man's dilemma. He thought that if such a big shot like Brando was here to accompany him, then what was the point of them staying? But Cohen didn't say a word. The thin youth was silent for a while, as if he had made up his mind. He stood up, raised the card in his hand again and threw it far away. "Sir, catch it." Cohen looked at Brando and shouted with all his strength. Brando turned his head and looked at him in surprise. "Are you crazy?" Mar was stunned by Cohen's action. But there was a satisfied smile on the thin boy's face. It was a smile full of ambition and yearning that was impossible to see on a person of his status. At that moment he was no longer a minor but a master of a region. Brando looked at him in confusion. Cohen stood up and straightened his back. "Sir, I've learned one thing during my days as an apprentice. I know that in the eyes of big shots, people like us are insignificant." He shook his head. "But I think that even insignificant people like us have the chance to change our fate. Maybe I can't do it, but at least now, I know that I have the chance to change the fate of a big shot like you." Everyone was stunned by his words. They couldn't help but think that this kid had gone crazy. But Cohen did not go crazy. Instead, he coughed, and with the help of the girl behind him, he continued, "I don't know what this card can bring you, but if it brings you good luck and allows you to get out of here, then in the future, in your legend, my lord, there will be a part of me. Isn't that right?" Brando was stunned. What kind of theory was this? This was the first time he looked at the young man again, and his heart was filled with surprise. He didn't know how to evaluate the other party's way of thinking. It was filled with the madness of a gambler, but it also made people feel a trace of admiration. It was a free and easy admiration. However, Brando was a little puzzled as to why the other party was so optimistic about him. He could not help but ask, "This card is indeed very meaningful to me, but even if I get it, I still can't change my fate of failure. Do you regret what I said?" Brando looked in that direction and spoke frankly about his current predicament. Hearing this, Yuta and Scarlet were stunned. They held their breaths at the same time. "Wait, kid, you." Coden finally realized what was going on. However, Cohen was not surprised. The youth smiled and said, "Yes, but as long as you pick up that card, you will at least accept my good intentions, won't you?" He continued, "Moreover, your words have confirmed my thoughts. As for the outcome, I don't care." Cohen? Joka and Mar were stunned. It was as if this was the first time they had met their comrade. But for some reason, these youths felt a sense of alienation and unfamiliarity towards their companion at this moment. However, they also faintly felt a sense of superiority towards the other party. Brendel had already given them the impression that he was undefeatable, but Cohen's aura seemed to be on the same level as him right now. This was something they could not imagine. Brando listened to Cohen's answer and fell silent. He thought that anyone who had such thoughts was either a madman or a true expert. However, when he looked at this young man named Cohen, he didn't look like a madman, nor did he look like a big shot. "But wait, what's your name?" Brando suddenly asked. "Cohen? Kvanna. My name was given to me by my mentor." The youth answered, "Lord Kvanna." It really was him. Brando finally understood. In history, Kvanna grew up in the countryside of Tanajil, but he did not expect him to grow up in the mines. Brando immediately thought of the game. Kvanna must have used this quest line to reach the peak of power. But what was it that changed his fate? Was it just the cold steel ores? Or was it something else? In history, Lord Kvanner had replaced Count Randner and became the King of Randner. His rise from a commoner to a duke was a living legend, and there was no record of him dying in the mines of Schafland. Then did this mean that there was still a chance? Or did history change because of his arrival? Brando's hand that was holding Halran Gaya's hilt trembled slightly. For the first time he was uncertain about the future. But when Roman heard the conversation between the youth and Brendel, and saw the youth's confusion, he could tell that something was wrong even if he was a carefree person. She frowned worriedly. "Brando, what should I do?" "Give up the challenge, Roman." Brando regained his senses and replied. No matter what the future was, he had to face his own choice. "Give up?" But at this moment, a voice interrupted. Even though the voice sounded old, it was full of vigor. It was the loud voice of the dwarves. Odom finally recovered from the shock of seeing the sanctuary built by the dwarven ancestors. The first thing he heard was Brando telling them to give up the challenge. This was intolerable. It was a blasphemy to the dignity of the dwarves. No dwarf would back down in the face of a challenge. That was the action of a coward. Furthermore, he was a noble rune dwarf, a descendant of the Silver family. Not to mention, this place was the hall that carried the souls of his ancestors. Countless souls of his ancestors were hovering above this sanctuary, watching everything that was happening below. How could he back down? Odom immediately expressed his dissatisfaction. Even if I'm an old man, I won't back down here. Moreover, this is the territory of the rune dwarfs. Rude brat. Coden felt that the word rude brat was the most appropriate description he had ever heard in his life. He even felt that the stubborn old dwarf was more pleasing to the eye. As far as he was concerned, this kid from the Tobuz family was indeed extremely rude. Odom, why are you here? Coden asked. The old dwarf was just beginning to complain to Brando, but he was already dead in his stomach. He was shocked when he saw Coden. He recognized the gold-ranked guard captain, but when he saw that Coden was covered in injuries, he couldn't help but be shocked. Captain Coden, what happened to you? Because the territory of the rune dwarves is really a good place. Coden raised his eyebrows and replied in an annoyed tone. Speaking of which, how did you become a rune dwarf? Aren't you a golden dwarf? The golden dwarves are just a part of my homeland. I'm a genuine rune dwarf. Odom was unhappy when he heard that someone was doubting his bloodline. Very well, I'll assume that you're a citizen of the Silver family. Then what are you doing here? Odom was stunned for a moment before he realized that the guard captain was smiling. Of course, it looked like a sinister smile to him. The old dwarf realized that he had fallen into a trap. He stammered as he tried to come up with an excuse. He couldn't possibly say that there was a huge treasure here, and that he had the right to inherit it as the only descendant of the rune dwarves, right? Count Randner would probably make him unworthy of his title as the only descendant of the rune dwarves, or at the very least, turn him from a lively state to a dead one. But just when he was in a dilemma, he saw the Howran Gaia in Brando's hand. The old dwarf's expression immediately changed. Zior. He blurted out, but quickly realized that something was wrong and shouted in Cruz, the king of Gaia? Why is this sword here? You know it too? Brando, who was ignored for a long time, looked at Odom and asked in surprise. There were not many people who knew about the Howran Gaia's inheritance. Even though Odom claimed to be the last descendant of the rune dwarves, he had seen too many of these so-called last descendants. Some of them had long forgotten about the inheritance of their civilization, and other than their physical characteristics, they did not have much to do with the Silver family. These people were called the Remnants, and they could be found all over the continent of Wond. Then again, which of the numerous black dwarves in the land of Vaunt wasn't a descendant of the ancient Golden race? But the Golden and Silver era had long passed. After the Dark era, the current Wond was no longer the same as described in the legends. Of course, sir. The old dwarf looked at Brando and lowered his head slightly for the first time. He could not help but be more respectful, which made Coden feel disgusted. He thought to himself that this old man was even faster than that coward Perkins. But before this, he had personally experienced the old dwarf's stubbornness. The old swordsman's gaze fell on Brando's sword. It seemed that he could only find out the reason from there. But even though the sword was a good one, was it that important? Brando also realized this at the same time. Is it very important to you? The young man gestured at the sword in his hand. But even so, Brando did not intend to give it to him. Not to mention that the sword could greatly increase his strength in the challenge later. Didn't he go through so much to complete the challenge just for this Howran Gaia? Rather than saying that it's important, it's more like saying that it's related to a legend. Odom was a little disappointed. He came for the treasure, but if this sword appeared here, it meant that his treasure was gone. The rune dwarves had many treasures, but there was only one related to the Howran Gaia. The old dwarf thought of the legend and could not help but look at Brando again. He was not a real rune dwarf, but only a branch of the rune dwarf bloodline left behind on the earth. He did not have the extraordinary talent of the real silver folk, and he did not even learn the construction skills of his ancestors, which were said to be comparable to the craftsmen of Buga. But he did not lie to Coden. He was indeed the inheritor of this civilization, or at least that was what he thought. From the moment he was born, there was a mysterious message in his mind, which was undoubtedly passed down through his bloodline. That was why Odom knew that there was a treasure under the mines of Schaflund. P.S. What should I say? Is the wheel of history slowly turning again? Please support me. Chapter 323. Cohen put down his hand as if he had thought it through. Mar and Joka looked at him from the side, feeling uncomfortable. After all, Cohen was still their comrade. For the youth, this separation was cruel. They had all thought about it. If Cohen couldn't leave, they would stay. At worst, they wouldn't be able to leave. Mar thought darkly to himself that Brendel might choose to stay behind as well, and he saw the young man's dilemma. He thought that if such a big shot like Brando was here to accompany him, then what was the point of them staying? But Cohen didn't say a word. The thin youth was silent for a while, as if he had made up his mind. He stood up, raised the card in his hand again and threw it far away. "Sir, catch it." Cohen looked at Brando and shouted with all his strength. Brando turned his head and looked at him in surprise. "Are you crazy?" Mar was stunned by Cohen's action. But there was a satisfied smile on the thin boy's face. It was a smile full of ambition and yearning that was impossible to see on a person of his status. At that moment he was no longer a minor but a master of a region. Brando looked at him in confusion. Cohen stood up and straightened his back. "Sir, I've learned one thing during my days as an apprentice. I know that in the eyes of big shots, people like us are insignificant." He shook his head. "But I think that even insignificant people like us have the chance to change our fate. Maybe I can't do it, but at least now, I know that I have the chance to change the fate of a big shot like you." Everyone was stunned by his words. They couldn't help but think that this kid had gone crazy. But Cohen did not go crazy. Instead he coughed and with the help of the girl behind him he continued, "I don't know what this card can bring you, but if it brings you good luck and allows you to get out of here, then in the future in your legend, my lord, there will be a part of me, isn't that right?" Brando was stunned. What kind of theory was this? This was the first time he looked at the young man again, and his heart was filled with surprise. He didn't know how to evaluate the other party's way of thinking. It was filled with the madness of a gambler, but it also made people feel a trace of admiration. It was a free and easy admiration. However, Brando was a little puzzled as to why the other party was so optimistic about him. He could not help but ask, "This card is indeed very meaningful to me, but even if I get it, I can't change my fate of failure. Do you regret what I said?" Brando looked in that direction and spoke frankly about his current predicament. Hearing this, Yuta and Scarlet were stunned. They held their breaths at the same time. "Wait, kid, you." Coden finally realized what was going on. However, Cohen was not surprised. The youth smiled and said, "Yes, but as long as you pick up that card, you will at least accept my good intentions, won't you?" He continued, "Moreover, your words have confirmed my thoughts. As for the outcome, I do not care." Cohen? Joka and Mar were stunned. It was as if this was the first time they had met their comrade. But for some reason, these youths felt a sense of alienation and unfamiliarity towards their companion at this moment. However, they also faintly felt a sense of superiority towards the other party. Brendel had already given them the impression that he was undefeatable, but Cohen's aura seemed to be on the same level as him right now. This was something they could not imagine. Brando was silent after hearing Cohen's answer. He thought that anyone who had such thoughts was either a madman or a true expert. However, when he looked at this young man named Cohen, he didn't look like a madman, nor did he look like a big shot. "But wait, what is your name?" Brando suddenly asked. "Cohen? Kvanna. My surname was given to me by my mentor." The youth answered, "Lord Kvanna. It really is this kid." Brando finally understood. In history, Kvanna grew up in the countryside of Tanajil, but he did not expect him to grow up in the mines. Brando immediately thought of the game. Kvanna must have passed through this quest line and reached the peak of power step by step. But what was it that changed his fate? Was it just the cold steel ores? Or was it something else? In history, Lord Kvanner had replaced Count Randner and became the King of Randner. His rise from a commoner to a duke was a living legend, and there was no record of him dying in the mines of Schafland. Then did this mean that there was still a chance? Or did history change because of his arrival? Brando's hand that was holding Halran Gaya's hilt trembled slightly. For the first time he was uncertain about the future. But when Roman heard the conversation between the youth and Brendel, and saw the youth's confusion, he could tell that something was wrong even if he was a carefree person. She furrowed her brows worriedly. "Brando, what should I do?" "Give up the challenge, Roman." Brando regained his senses and replied. No matter what the future was, he had to face his choice. Give up? But at this moment, a voice interrupted. Even though the voice sounded old, it was full of vigor. It was the unique loud voice of the dwarves. Odom finally recovered from the shock of seeing the sanctuary built by the dwarven ancestors. The first thing he heard was Brando telling them to give up the challenge. This was intolerable. It was a blasphemy to the dignity of the dwarves. No dwarf would back down in the face of a challenge. That was the action of a coward. Moreover, he was a noble rune dwarf, a descendant of the Silver family. Not to mention that this place was the hall that carried the souls of his ancestors. Countless souls of his ancestors were hovering above this sanctuary, watching everything that was happening below. How could he back down? Odom immediately expressed his dissatisfaction. Even if I'm an old man, I won't back down here. Moreover, this is the territory of the rune dwarves. You impolite brat. Coden felt that the word, impolite brat, was right in his heart. He felt that he had never heard of such an adjective in his life, and even felt that the stubborn old dwarf was a little more pleasing to the eye. From his point of view, this brat from the Tobuz family was indeed impolite. Odom, what are you doing here? But he still asked first. The old dwarf was just beginning to complain to Brando, but it was already stillborn. When he saw Coden, he was shocked. He recognized this gold-ranked guard captain, but when he saw the injuries all over his body, he couldn't help but be shocked. Captain Coden, why are you like this? Because the territory of the rune dwarves is really a good place to be. Coden raised his eyebrows and replied in an annoyed tone. Speaking of which, how did you become a rune dwarf? Aren't you a golden dwarf? The golden dwarves are just a part of my homeland. I am a genuine rune dwarf. Odom was displeased when he heard that someone was doubting his bloodline. All right, let's assume that you are a citizen of the Silver family. Then what are you doing here? Odom was stunned for a moment before he noticed the smile on Coden's face. Of course, it looked like a sinister smile to him. The old dwarf finally realized that he had fallen into a trap. He stammered as he tried to come up with an excuse. He couldn't possibly say that there was a huge treasure here, and as the only descendant of the rune dwarves, he had the right to inherit it, right? Count Randner would probably make him unworthy of his title as the only descendant of the rune dwarves, or at the very least, turn him from a lively state to a dead one. But just when he was in a dilemma, he saw the Howran Gaia in Brando's hand. The old dwarf's expression immediately changed. Zor. He blurted out, but he quickly realized that something was wrong and shouted in Cruz, King of the Earth. Why is this sword here? You know it too? Brando, who had been ignored for a long time, looked at Odom and asked in surprise. There were not many people who knew about the Howran Gaia's inheritance. Even though Odom claimed to be the last descendant of the rune dwarves, he had seen too many of these so-called last descendants. Some of them had long forgotten about the inheritance of their civilization, and other than their physical characteristics, they did not have much to do with the Silver family. These people were called the Remnants, and they could be found all over the continent of Wond. Then again, which of the numerous black dwarves in the land of Vaunt wasn't a descendant of the ancient Golden race? But the Golden and Silver era had long passed. After the Dark era, the current Wond was no longer the same as what was described in the legends. Of course, sir. The old dwarf looked at Brando and lowered his head slightly for the first time. He could not help but be more respectful, which made Coden feel disgusted. He thought to himself that the old dwarf was even faster than that coward Perkins. But before this, he had personally experienced the old dwarf's stubbornness. The old swordsman's gaze fell on Brando's sword. It seemed that he could only find out the reason from there. But even though the sword was a good one, was it that important? Brando also realized this at the same time. Is it very important to you? The young man gestured at the sword in his hand. But even so, Brando did not intend to give it to him. Not to mention that the sword could greatly increase his strength in the challenge later. Didn't he go through so much to complete the challenge just for this Howran Gaia? Rather than saying it's important, it's more like it's related to a legend. Odom was a little disappointed. He was here for the treasure, but if this sword appeared here, it meant that his treasure was gone. The rune dwarves had many treasures, but there was only one related to the Howran Gaia. The old dwarf thought of the legend and could not help but look at Brando again. He was not a real rune dwarf, but only a branch of the rune dwarf bloodline left behind on the earth. He did not have the extraordinary talent of the real silver folk, and he did not even learn the construction skills of his ancestors, which were said to be comparable to the craftsmen of Buga. But he did not lie to Coden. He was indeed the inheritor of this civilization, or at least that was what he thought. From the moment he was born, there was a mysterious message in his mind, which was undoubtedly passed down through his bloodline. That was why Odom knew that there was a treasure under the mines of Schaflund. P.S. What should I say? Is the wheel of history slowly turning again? It's time for support. Chapter 324. And it was because he knew all of this that he came all the way here. Perhaps it wasn't just for the treasure. Even Odom himself wasn't sure, but there was a voice in his blood telling him that he had a dream. That dream was to return the legacy of the Rune Dwarves to the land of Wond. It was just like the legend of the revival of the Rune Dwarves. He looked at the sword in Brando's hand and hesitated. The voice in his heart told him that he should believe in the legend, but how could he believe it? According to the legend, all the Rune Dwarves had to worship the person who held the Haoran Gaia as their king and follow him to rebuild the Rune Dwarven Empire. But for this old dwarf to bow down to a stranger, it was really too difficult for his old bones. Legend? Brando asked. Odom gritted his teeth and decided to hold on to his wits and take one step at a time. The old dwarf coughed and said, "Forgive me for not being able to say much, but I heard your conversation. Do you want to leave this place?" "What do you mean?" Brando's attention was drawn to the old dwarf. "It's nothing, my lord." The old dwarf chose a title that was easier for him to accept. He thought that if he suddenly called Brendel king, not only would he not be able to accept it, but everyone else would be shocked as well. "I just want to say that there's no need to go through so much trouble." He paused for a moment and pointed at the sword in Brando's hand. "If you can lend me that sword for a while, I might be able to let everyone leave this place easily." Brando had never heard of such a thing before. He and Medisha looked at each other and saw the suspicion in each other's eyes. It wasn't just them, even the old swordsman beside them asked, "Odom, what are you doing?" "Let me tell you, this brat is much stronger than me. If you play any tricks in front of him, be careful not to get yourself involved." The old dwarf was stunned for a moment and immediately said, "I'm telling the truth, damn it," but he thought for a moment and wisely avoided conflict with Coden. Even though dwarves were stubborn, he wasn't a reckless person. This sanctuary was built by us Rune Dwarves to store the sword. Since my lord has the sword, leaving this place shouldn't be a problem. "Is there such a thing?" Brando asked. He didn't know that the Arena of Destiny had such a setup. "Of course, but my lord, you won't be able to do it. You know that the silver legacy is actually left for the descendants of this bloodline. Even though you are the descendants of the people of Order, you are still of a different race." The old dwarf's attitude towards Brando was clearly different. "But I'm different. I have the blood of the Rune Dwarves flowing in my veins. With that sword, I might be able to open this space." Brendel turned to look at Coden, but the old captain seemed to be hesitating. Even though he had interacted with Odom before, the only thing he knew about him was his stubbornness. Even the old man himself wasn't sure if he knew what kind of person Odom was. However, the young man had already made up his mind. The sword was his spoils of war in this space. In the game, the power of the laws protected this, and he believed that it would be the same here. He thought that even if he gave the sword to the old dwarf, he wouldn't be able to play any tricks. Moreover, the old dwarf's words made his heart skip a beat. The old dwarf's words were not without reason. In the past, he had never heard of such rumors in the game. That was because there were no silver or gold bloodlines among the players, so it was natural that they wouldn't trigger such a storyline in the Sanctum. Therefore, Brando only pondered for a moment before throwing the sword over. "Try it," he said. "It would be best if they didn't have to stay here." Thinking of this, he couldn't help but look at Cohen. Could this be the turning point of history? "What's wrong, sir?" Cohen noticed his gaze and asked. "Looks like you're quite lucky," Brando said to him. "Are you so sure that he can do it?" The young man watched as the dwarf took the sword and walked to the center of the arena. He turned around and looked at Brando in confusion. "No," Brando shook his head, "I only believe in history." "History?" Cohen asked in disbelief. However, Brando did not answer him. Instead, he raised his hand and a gust of wind wrapped around the card of fate on the ground and flew it towards himself. He reached out and caught the Fireclaw Lord card and said to himself in his heart, frowny face system notification, "Reward obtained." Then he smiled faintly. "My lord?" Medisha noticed Brando's expression and was puzzled. In her heart, Brando was not someone who would be happy over such a small gain. Brendel did not answer her either. He only looked up at the center of the arena. At the same time, the old dwarf had already raised Haurangaya with both hands. The voice in the sky echoed again. "Mortal, do you accept the challenge?" "Of course." Odom's words gave everyone a fright. But this time the challenge did not come as expected. After a moment of silence, the voice in the sky asked, "I seem to sense a familiar aura from your body. Are you our descendant?" "Yes, the souls of my ancestors in Chongshan," the old dwarf replied. "Like you, I am a citizen of the mountains and rocks, a child of metal and fire. For thousands of years, we have endured hardships in the wilderness, but in the end we managed to overcome all difficulties to come here, just so that our souls can enjoy a moment of peace. Because this is our origin, my homeland. The arena was silent for a moment, but then the voice roared, "Peace? No, the time has not come yet." His voice rumbled like thunder as if enraged, causing everyone to stagger from side to side. Our descendants in the wilderness, you will have to continue trekking until the time comes, and your souls will return to the holy sanctum. The time has come, the souls of my ancestors in Chongshan. Is that so? A voice suddenly sounded in the air and the entire space buzzed. The old dwarf hesitated for a moment and looked back at Brando. He was in disbelief, but he still raised Haurangaya. Das Motram. The dwarf replied. It was a strange language that Brando did not recognize, but Medisha did. She frowned and explained to her lord, "The mantra of order, it seems to be a part of the sacred covenant." Brando naturally knew what the sacred covenant was. It was a covenant that all intelligent beings signed with Martha to fight against the Twilight Dragon before the Age of Darkness. A part of the covenant was the law of order, and it was said that it came from the era before the current era, which was the era before the gods. It was also the era that Brando called meaningless background. After the sacred covenant, the forces of justice signed another sacred covenant to fight against the Twilight Dragon, but that agreement was written in the ancient language and was far inferior to the original one. The sacred covenant was a divine weapon that symbolized the law of order. But after Odom said those words, the entire space shook, and everyone felt that the space around them was loosening. This meant that the old dwarf did not lie to them and his method worked. But at this moment, Brendel suddenly felt like he was hallucinating amidst the vibrations of space. He saw a strange image appearing in front of him. A black moon, a dark lake, and a tall tower that stood silently in the middle of it, as if it was a metaphor for something. Then the image changed to a group of black-clothed people walking on an endless wasteland. Then he saw a row of black words, 16. The tower, the lost moon has taken away the light. He remembered that he had seen this row of words when he escaped from Fortress Reden, but a new row of words appeared below it, XX. Judgment, the light has lost. The words continued to appear, 17. The star, the silver generation has been lost on the earth, traversing the darkness and obscurity, seeking. Then all the strange images disappeared. Brando shook his head and woke up, and saw Medisha looking at him with concern. He nodded to the silver elf girl, indicating that he was fine. However, he shifted his gaze slightly and saw the merchant girl slowly and carefully approaching him, as if she wanted to ask him something out of concern, but she didn't dare to let him see her for fear of being killed by him. Brando looked at the Roman and could not help but laugh and said to Medisha, "In the end, we should really thank someone this time." Medisha was slightly surprised. "Thank you, little Romaine, for bringing us good luck." The young man turned around with a stern face. His hand had already pinched the merchant lady's pink cheeks at lightning speed. "Isn't that right, little Romaine?" It hurts, Brando. I won't do it again." The Roman's face was pinched and she squinted her eyes, tears almost coming out of her eyes from the pain. She quickly admitted her mistake loudly, I'm sorry." Her pair of small eyebrows were almost raised. She wanted to retreat, but she was afraid of the pain and she was in a dilemma. Brando glanced at the old dwarf, then looked at the Roman and asked, "Do you dare to run around again?" "No, I don't dare." The girl's eyes turned left and right as she answered. Brando was helpless. He knew that this girl would not repent, but he had already made up his mind to bring her along no matter where he went. Otherwise, no one would be able to take it if this happened again. He sighed and let go of his hand. At the same time, the light around them dimmed, as if they had entered a space where they could not see their own fingers. "What's wrong?" The Roman's voice immediately sounded. "Nothing." Brando felt the surroundings and answered, "That's why we're back. P.S. This is power. Thank you everyone for your support. Is there more? To be continued. If you want to know more, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 325. In the last few days of autumn and early winter, Paydarson was already desolate. The trees were already bare, but the forest was like a monster with its fangs and claws on both sides of the road. The sound of horse hooves came from afar. 11 night parted the white fog and broke into the silent morning. To ensure speed, the riders kept their mounts running at a small pace, but did not gallop. There were about 100 miles from here to Luda, and they had to maintain their horses. Except for the rider in the middle who carried a long black cloth bag, the others were fully armed. Swords and crossbows that flashed with cold light occasionally peeked out from under their long cloaks. The knight was on high alert and looked around from time to time. The forest in early winter was cold and bleak, but there were still wolves in the forest. The knight kept moving forward and soon came to a small river. At this time of the year, the river had not yet frozen, and the water was sparkling. There was a cold stone bridge on the shore. But at this time, the leading knight suddenly raised his hand and asked the others to stop. The knight tightened the reins to stop the horses and looked around. The leading knight withdrew his hand and gestured to the left and right, meaning that there was an ambush. Then he turned his horse around and pulled out his long sword from his waist. The knight turned their horses around and immediately formed a circular formation with the escorts as the center. The uniform movements showed that these knights were well trained. Even the scouts in Erwin's army could not reach this level. But as the knight moved, there was a rustling sound in the forest. Immediately, a group of noble private soldiers in leather armor stood up from the bushes on both sides. These ambushers were all armed with battle axes, small round shields or crossbows. Apparently the ambushers realized that they had been discovered and were ready to attack. But the knight's reaction was not slow either. They were even faster than these ambushers. The knight in black did not hesitate to untie the crossbows at their waists and shoot in all directions. A few of the ambushers had just rushed out of the bushes and onto the road when they were shot down. The knight's archery skills were excellent, and they continuously turned their horses around to fire arrows in all directions. Many of the ambushers were shot in the throat, and the corpses quickly formed a circle around them. But the Awin cavalry's crossbows had limited ammunition, and the private soldiers seemed to be aware of this. After 5 rounds of shooting, they let out a battle cry and rushed out of the forest. However, the knights were not in a hurry. They lifted their cloaks with their left hand and pulled out a hand axe with their right hand. They threw it forward in unison. A series of screams resounded through the sky, startling many birds that were still in their dreams. They flapped their wings and flew out from the surrounding forest. The ambushers were caught off guard, and the front row of people fell instantly. Quick! Go, they are out of weapons. Don't give them a chance to reload their bows. But the pungent smell of blood in the cold morning air only excited these fugitives. Some of the nobles' private soldiers shouted madly. They had an absolute advantage in numbers, almost 10 times the number of their opponents. Even if they had to sacrifice a lot of lives, they would still kill their opponents. The knight's calmness had angered these people. The ambushers rushed forward in a frenzy, trying to turn the battle into a bloody melee. But they found that things were not as they had imagined. Their opponents were far stronger than they had imagined. The knight drew their swords together, and a dramatic change occurred on the battlefield. Accompanied by the silver light of the swords, white streams of air crisscrossed and formed an impenetrable net. The ambushers who rushed forward rashly crashed into it. Then flesh and blood splattered everywhere. Broken bodies and limbs fell backward, making it look like a rain of blood was falling from the heads of the ambushers. Many of the ambushers were completely stunned. They were told in advance that their opponents were a group of knights from the kingdom. But no one told them that the knight's strength was at the peak of the silver level. At first, the nobles' private soldiers could still rely on inertia to rush forward to the knights who were as cold as the Grim Reaper. But in less than a moment, the morale of this motley crew had completely collapsed. Before they could get close, they had lost nearly 1/3 of their men. Once their feverish heads cooled down, these nobles' private soldiers realized the horror of their opponents. Without further reminders, they scattered. They even fled faster than when they came, at least twice as fast. The battle ended quickly. The leading knight stopped and took a deep breath of the bloody air. He raised his hand to stop his men from chasing. But how many ambushes had they encountered along the way? Chasing after them was also meaningless. They wouldn't be able to catch any valuable targets, not to mention that their own mission was the most important. All the knights stopped. They checked their left and right, then bent down to wipe their swords on the corpses before sheathing them. No one spoke during the entire process. Only the sound of horses rubbing their noses could be heard. The leading knight's gray eyes swept across the battlefield. He looked at the corpses that littered the ground. These nobles' private soldiers did not have any obvious markings on them to indicate which side they belonged to. They also did not have any banners. They looked more like a group of bandits. But bandits were not so well trained. Then he pulled down the hood of his cloak, revealing a middle-aged man's thin and pale face. He looked back. The rider they were escorting patted the long black bag on his back as a sign of safety. Then the rider looked up and pulled down his hood. It was a young man's face. To be precise, Brando knew the owner of this face as well. He was Turst, Viscount Turst. But the Viscount's appearance had changed. He had lost a lot of weight over the past month. His complexion had also become paler. His eyes seemed to be burning with a lake green flame. Safe. If Brando was here, he would definitely be shocked by the Viscount's words. His voice was hoarse and dry, as if someone had poked a hole in his throat. The young man sniffed as if it took a lot of effort for him to speak. Who are these people? The middle-aged man asked as he looked at the corpses on the ground. Duke Erex's men. Turst replied with a hoarse voice. Him? The middle-aged man paused for a moment. Wasn't that old bastard trying to get on our good side? Nobles are all two-faced bastards. You don't need to look at me. I'm the same. So don't trust me. If there's a chance, I'll definitely stab you in the back. The middle-aged man smiled. Interesting. But don't worry, I only trust my own men. Humph. Turst did not even look at the man. He pulled up his hood and prepared to leave. But at that moment, the young Viscount froze. He saw a flash of green light in the forest, and his expression immediately became very bad. Behind you. Turst put down his hood and warned the middle-aged knight. The leader of the knight turned around, but it was too late. The green light hit him squarely in the chest. The middle-aged man was shocked at what kind of sorcery this was, but his expression was frozen in that moment. Turst saw the leader of the knights turn into a stone statue in front of him. That bastard is here. The young Viscount's heart raced. He knew who it was as soon as he saw this familiar scene. That nightmarish memory was still tormenting him, but he didn't expect that the nightmare would become reality again. He almost wanted to run, but his hands and feet seemed to have grown roots, and they didn't listen to his command as if they were possessed. Then he saw the monster covered in emerald green armor coming out of the forest. All the knights were stunned. Of course, they saw what happened to their captain, but such a strange way of attack was beyond everyone's understanding. They didn't know what to do at this time. Guard against it? But no one dared to say that they had a better defense against that green light. They wanted to avenge their leader, but who knew what the enemy was capable of? The knights froze in place for a moment. But the Emerald Knight did not seem to appreciate their kindness. He walked step by step towards Turst, who was in the center of the knight's protection. Facing the approaching knight, the young Viscount who possessed the strength of a beginner gold tier realized that he was so frightened that he could not move at all. It was so difficult for him to even utter a single word from his throat. You. Just as he managed to squeeze out a word, one of the knight couldn't take it anymore and attacked the Emerald Knight. However, the other party merely raised his hand and blocked his long sword. Then, the knight was sent flying along with his horse, crashing into a black pine tree not far away. After that, there was no more sound from him. The Emerald Knight's move shocked everyone, but it also made the knight realize that this was an enemy. The knights shouted in unison and stabbed their swords at the knight. But before the swords could reach him, they were blocked by a layer of green light around the Emerald Knight's body. It was a top-grade magic armor. Everyone's heart sank. The outer layer of top-grade magic armor had a powerful magic defense. This kind of protection could not only defend against ordinary magic attacks, but could even block physical attacks like swords and sabers. In Erewhon, this kind of armor was only made by the royal alchemists during the golden age of the kingdom. It was extremely rare, but the person who owned it was definitely not a simple person. The knights' hearts sank as they tried to guess who the enemy was. Unfortunately, they didn't realize that their days were numbered. Turst couldn't even open his mouth to warn them because the knights had already noticed that their swords, including their magic swords, were slowly being petrified. This discovery scared them out of their wits. Some of them quickly threw away their swords, but it was useless. In the end, the dozen or so knights turned into stone statues. Turst felt like he was going to collapse when he saw this scene. But in reality, when the Emerald Knight slowly approached him, he realized that he wasn't losing his mind. Although he wished that this was a dream. The Emerald Knight slowly approached his horse and stared at him. He didn't speak, nor did he attack. He just stood there motionless. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 326. At that moment, time seemed to have frozen. The young Viscount was drenched in cold sweat as he mustered all his strength to speak. What are you trying to do? The Emerald Knight pointed at the bag on his back. His meaning is clear. The sword on you. You were the one who told me to bring the sword out. Turst took a deep breath and started panting heavily. What are you trying to do? When he said the last sentence, the young Viscount was almost roaring in anger. Terst had never been toyed with like this in his entire life. He felt like he was being toyed with like a little girl. Instead of playing games with this freak, he would rather be killed by the other party. But when he saw the petrified captain not far away from him, Terst couldn't help but shudder. The Emerald Knight's face was expressionless. Of course, his cold mask didn't reveal any emotions. He pointed at the long bundle on Terst's back and pressed on his chest. The young Viscount understood the knight's meaning. The knight wanted him to hand over the sword. But what kind of joke is this? If I hand over the sword, how am I going to answer to the other senators and elders in All for One? It wasn't easy for him to gain the attention of the higher-ups in All for One because of this mission. Otherwise, they wouldn't have sent an entire squad of elite knights to protect him. But now, not only did he lose these knights, he might also lose this important thing. If this matter is pursued, no matter what his status in All for One is, he might not be able to walk away unscathed. He might be the Holy Son, but he wasn't the only one. Terst panted heavily as he glared at the Emerald Knight with bloodshot eyes. He wanted to see if there was any change in the knight's expression, but it was a pity that the helmet didn't allow him to see any expression. The young Viscount pondered for a moment as he struggled internally. He had no doubt that if he refused, the knight would turn him into a statue as well. He didn't understand why the Emerald Knight let him go so many times. There was no reason for the knight to only keep him alive. The knight could have easily killed him and taken the Lionheart sword. But the knight didn't do so and instead gave him a choice. Was it just for fun? But this was obviously unrealistic. Terst hesitated for a moment before he finally made a difficult decision. What do you think? Terst looked at the young man and hesitated for a moment before he made a difficult decision. The young man reached a hand behind his back, untied the long bundle, and threw it to the other party. Why didn't you kill me? He asked at the same time. The Emerald Knight bent down and picked up the Lionheart sword. It was as if he wasn't afraid of Terst's sneak attack at all. Terst took a deep breath and suppressed his urge to attack. The unimaginable strength displayed by this monster made him unable to even muster the will to resist. Of course, it wasn't that he didn't resist, but the result was a crushing defeat. He had already experienced this feeling once on the island in the middle of the lake. The Emerald Knight glanced at Terst. You're not willing to accept your fate, but you're willing to bow to the other side? The Emerald Knight asked. This was the first time Terst heard the Emerald Knight speak. His voice was muffled under the helmet, and he couldn't tell whether he was male or female. Which side? Terst frowned, a hint of dissatisfaction flashing in his dark green eyes. The young Viscount was ready to throw caution to the wind. The worst that could happen was death. He didn't even care about the punishment from the Unifying Guild. He handed over the Lionheart sword to the Emerald Knight because he wanted to know why this monster was so against him. There's nothing wrong with being rebellious towards the world, but to be used by others because of that is foolish. The Emerald Knight replied. You're talking about the Unifying Guild? Terst asked. I'm just using them. Wait. The Emerald Knight picked up the Lionheart sword and walked towards the river. Terst watched as the strange knight walked towards the stone bridge and threw the Lionheart sword into the cold water. At that moment he thought the knight had gone mad, but he quickly calmed down. What did it matter if the knight was mad or not? The Knight of the Lake's last sentence was still echoing in his mind. Wait. Terst felt that he was indeed weak, but he suddenly smiled bitterly. He couldn't help but think about how he should deal with the punishment from the Unifying Guild. He raised his head again to look at the culprit who had caused all this trouble. But the Emerald Knight was nowhere to be seen. For a girl like Freya who came from the countryside of Wuxia, the days in the Royal Knights Academy seemed to pass faster than anywhere else. The withered leaves on the trees were dyed a golden red yesterday, but in the blink of an eye, they were all gone. This was the resting time between training sessions, and the future goddess of war was sitting on the stone steps in a daze. She rested her chin on the hilt of her sword, hugging it with both hands as she stared at the dark green mountains in the distance. When she saw the bare shadows of the trees, she realized that winter was coming. It had been almost half a year since she came here. She thought in a daze. She slowly got used to the life here, and the change in her mentality made her ignore the changes in her surroundings. The summer leaves were lush, the autumn leaves were red, and the winter leaves were withered. A year had passed just like that. Her daily life had become as boring as an ascetic. In order to become stronger, she had pushed away all activities. Every day she would train, and rest. This future goddess of war was trying her best to reach her goal. She couldn't tell if it was for the sake of everyone in Wuxia, or if it was just because of the young man's expectations for her. But every time she thought of Brando's gentle and caring gaze, Freya's heart skipped a beat, and she felt as if she couldn't breathe. Sometimes she felt that it was too embarrassing for her to be like this, but she couldn't get rid of his shadow. Brando. She unconsciously muttered his name, and didn't notice that someone had come in front of her. Then the future goddess of war was shocked and raised her head. She saw the black-haired knight standing in front of her with her hand on her sword, and her face turned red. Freya stood up at a loss and did not know where to place her hands. "What's wrong?" Maynard tilted her head and looked at her. "No. Nothing." Freya lowered her head and answered absent-mindedly. She felt that even she couldn't believe her own words. But this time the strict knight didn't scold her like she usually did, or ask her why she wasn't alert at all. She came over and put her hand on her forehead without saying a word. Her palm was cold. This intimate action made Freya freeze, and the future goddess of war was so scared that she almost turned around and ran away. But when she saw Maynard's dark and caring eyes, she was stunned. "Homesick?" Maynard put down her hand and asked in a low voice without any expression on her face. "No." Freya shook her head but suddenly nodded. She thought that if she didn't go along with what Vivian said, she wouldn't be able to explain what she was doing there. "Freya, you're such an idiot." She scolded herself in her heart. "You can't even lie. That guy can lie without blushing." Maynard sighed when she saw that the young lady's mind had wandered off again. She could roughly guess what the other lady was thinking. But she didn't ask. Instead, she put her hand under her shawl and took out a letter. His letter. Brando's letter? Freya was startled and blurted out. But she immediately realized that something was wrong and subconsciously covered her mouth. This was a little too obvious. Maynard's expressionless face flashed a smile. This was the first time that Freya saw her smile. "So his name is Brando. Lucky guy." "Lucky? What lucky?" Freya lowered her head and felt that her ears were burning. She defended herself with a voice that was so soft that even she couldn't hear it. But she still hurriedly took the letter with a cautious look. At this time, the two heard the sound of a carriage's wheels. The sudden sound came from one side of the road outside the academy. But at this time of the year, very few people came back from outside. Both of them were attracted by the sound and turned around at the same time. They immediately saw a white carriage, like a ghost breaking through the morning fog, slowly driving into the academy. Then it slowly passed by the two of them and entered the depths of the academy. Freya knew that the direction was the residence of Her Royal Highness. It was guarded by the royal knight and ordinary people couldn't enter. "That's," she whispered. Maynard saw the shield-shaped article on the carriage. The violet on it was so eye-catching. She looked at it for a while and said, "Someone from Anthony. Another lucky guy." The knight's tone was a little unfriendly. "What?" Freya was startled. "Nothing." Maynard shook her head. Her long and beautiful black hair had always made Freya envious. "You just focus on your own things. Freya, you're improving very quickly. Don't be discouraged." Thank you." The knight paused for a while and remembered something. "By the way, did that guy come to you again?" Freya was stunned and then realized that the knight was talking about the second son of Earl Beckberg. She had cut off contact with him since Maynard reminded her, but she didn't expect him to gather a group of people to make trouble for her. In the end, the knight somehow found out about that matter and she personally taught those people a lesson. The second son of Earl Beckberg was even almost expelled from the academy because of it. However, the matter was left unsettled. Although Freya was a little confused, she knew that it was the result of a compromise. But she was already very grateful. In comparison, she was just a commoner. But why was she bringing it up now? She raised her head and looked at Maynard in confusion. If you want to know what's to come, please log on to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 327. That's all, Senior Maynard. Maynard chuckled, but her expression quickly turned serious. You need to be careful. That brat is starting to get restless again. But this time they're quite secretive. I can't find anything on them yet. Freya raised her head and looked at her worriedly. Don't worry, the black-haired knight took a deep breath. I'm here. Just be careful. With that, she raised her head and looked at the direction where the carriage disappeared to. The sky in the north was gloomy as if a terrible storm was brewing. But would this storm come before the end of winter? No one knew. Maynard only knew that everyone in the academy was beginning to panic. This last piece of land in the kingdom might not be a safe haven, but the center of a huge whirlpool in the future. As for this temporary peace, it was just the illusion of the calm before the storm. At the very least, the knight knew that in the north, in the free port of Ampere Seal, a war without smoke was about to begin. She turned her head and looked deeply at Freya. "Can you do it?" she asked. "What?" Freya was stunned. The future Valkyrie's dazed look amused Maynard. She covered her mouth slightly and replied with amusement, "Nothing." In the last few days of the month of frost, everything seemed to converge together. When the situation in the north was on the verge of collapse, time also flew by. In the blink of an eye, 2 weeks had passed in the Schaflund mines. The incident that caused everyone to panic turned out to be a farce. This farce was spread widely in the town at first, but it was quickly forgotten. People were always forgetful. Apart from the families of the injured and the deceased who would forever remember this day, most people returned to their original trajectory of life after just a short week. On the surface, the Schaflund mines seemed to be unchanged, maintaining the same old appearance as it had for decades. But under the surface, some things were slowly changing. First, Coden's movements were restricted after Brando and the others left the mines. Under Brendel's instructions, the old man announced that he would temporarily hand over all his duties in the mines to Perkins, and shut himself in to recuperate. As for the cowardly clerk, he had completely surrendered when Brendel and Medisa barged into his office. Now that Jana and more than 20 peak iron-ranked mercenaries had disguised themselves and were monitoring the clerk 24 hours a day, he wouldn't dare to play any tricks even if he was given 100,000 guts. In fact, it was the opposite of what Brando expected. Perkins seemed to be more cautious and diligent than before, to the point that even his own subordinates who did not know the truth praised him. Were praises. Those deputies probably thought that their boss had finally repented and turned over a new leaf after shouldering all the work in the mining area, and had become pragmatic and willing to work. Even the spies sent by Count Randner to monitor Brendel's performance in secret had given him good reviews for the past 2 weeks. Of course, all of these reports went through Brando's hands. When Brando showed these reports to the cowardly clerk, Perkins cursed out loud for the first time. Of course, after cursing out loud, he looked around cautiously, as if he was afraid that his disrespect towards Count Randner would be heard by the spies in the surroundings. This is the so-called mud that cannot support a wall. Brendel shook his head involuntarily. But in order to appease the cowardly clerk, Brando promised him that he would not reveal the details of his work to anyone. He would only say that he was going to imprison him and find someone similar to him to replace him. Even though this lie seemed to be easily exposed, it at least gave the clerk some psychological comfort. Now that he was constantly living in fear, he could only rely on this little bit of comfort to live. As for Coden, he was sent to Abies the next day. When the old man saw the county, he knew that he could not escape. However, he still rejected Brando's goodwill and asked him to keep his promise and let him go when the time was up. Brendel shook his head with a smile when he saw the report. He was sitting at a table in a certain room in the Forest Trout Inn in Schaflund. Coden was obviously related to his grandfather, but the old swordsman did not mention a word about it after they left the underground. The young man intended to find out the truth of the secret from the other party, but he was not in a hurry. After all, he had plenty of ways to do it. Compared to that, he had more pressing matters to attend to. So he put this matter aside and turned back to look at the back of the merchant girl who was buried in a large pile of books. After leaving the underground, he had scolded this disobedient young lady. Originally, he thought that Roman would ignore him for a few days, but when he left the mine, this young girl who claimed to be a great merchant still held his hand tightly. It was as if she was holding an important treasure and was afraid of losing it if she wasn't careful. Brando regretted it a little and felt that he was too harsh with his words. But he did not expect that in just a few hours, the merchant girl would return to her old ways and swagger around. When the Nightsong Tiger arrived and Brando ordered Yuta to make a copy of the books, the young Roman finally calmed down. She had been working for 2 days and her progress was unbelievably fast. She seemed to have an innate talent in this aspect. She could easily distinguish what she wanted from the complicated numbers and abbreviations. It was a good thing that Vaughn's accounting system was rather simple, and was still in a very primitive stage. Roman quickly investigated Perkins and the others' deficits, and checked out the loopholes in the accounts one by one. However, Brando knew that it was not the time to make a bold move in the mine. At least in name, the mine was still under Count Randner's jurisdiction. He and the Roman could not enter the mine and meet with Yuta as they wished to avoid attracting the attention of the spies in the mine. In fact, the 20 or so mercenaries that Count Randner placed in Randner's camp used the excuse of needing to replenish the casualties from the mining accident. These mercenaries would not be needed for too long, and Count Randner would not allow too many unfamiliar faces to appear in his territory. It would take at most a month for the new mercenaries to be replenished. Of course, Brando could still obstruct them, but it would take at most 2 months. 2 months was more than enough for Brando. Thus, he put this matter aside and waited to settle the score in the future. But other than this important matter, there were also other small matters that gave him a headache. For example, the young men who came out from the underground with them, Cohen, Joka, and Mar. Brando admired the thin young man, or rather, the future king of Randner. Regardless of what Brando knew or saw, this young man was definitely not willing to be an ordinary person. In fact, this thin young man's performance in the underground also proved this point. But what surprised Brando was that Cohen rejected his invitation. The young man clearly stated that he and his friends would leave this place and go to the outside world according to their original plan. This news made Brando feel that it was a pity. King Randner was not an ordinary person, but he also knew that he could not force them to stay. He could only let them stay in Schafland for the time being, and wait for 2 months before deciding whether to stay or leave. On the other hand, Brando did not manage to keep the people who were supposed to stay. The people who were not supposed to stay were left behind. The strange old dwarf claimed to be the only descendant of the Rune dwarves, and his performance in the underground world seemed to prove this point. Of course, this was not a big deal. What really made Brando feel strange was that this old dwarf seemed to have appeared in front of him for the past few days. Of course, the bad-tempered old dwarf didn't seem to treat him well, but at least he wasn't as cold as before. But for this reason, Brando still kept Haurangaya. He was originally worried that this was the old dwarf's goal, but he did not expect that the old dwarf was still the same as before. It was as if he was not affected at all. Brando could only attribute this to the old dwarf's mental illness, and then turned his head to ignore him. Because a few days later, another more important matter completely diverted his attention. The Night Song Tiger and his men arrived at the mine. They were thinking of ways to secretly transport all the silver ores stored in Schafland's warehouse, smelted them, and sent them to Abies to be used as currency. At the same time, the Night Song Tiger brought good news to Brando. In fact, on the 3rd day after they left, the Shire found Grodin's private mint in a nearby manor. But there was a small interlude. When the nobles' private soldiers hiding in the manor realized that their whereabouts were exposed, they immediately closed the door and did not allow the mercenaries to enter. They even clamored to fight until the last man. This action obviously angered the leader of a small mercenary group that joined Brando's side. The leader was called Madron, and compared to his strength, he was more famous for his fiery temper. That was why he wanted to teach these mercenaries a lesson. Since they wanted to resist to the last person, then he would fulfill their wish. But just when this barrel of gunpowder was about to go head-on, our young wizard vetoed his request. Charles only sent a message to Madeline, "Wait and see." This sentence had a miraculous effect. On the 2nd day, the arrogant private soldiers of the nobles raised the white flag and opened the door to surrender dejectedly. Although the mercenaries present at the time felt that this sorcerer was mysterious and unfathomable. But soon they realized that it was not a big deal. The reason was simple. By this time, news of Sir Maxon's defeat had already spread throughout Tanajul. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 328. Let's turn our attention to Paydarson. The core of Randner Province was located at the border between Randner Province, Arek, and Frada. Originally, it was to prevent the Highlanders from invading the north, but as the kingdom's rule over the south gradually stabilized, it became the center of political symbolism. Currently, Randner's largest fortress was Fort Balasar, but Count Randner still preferred to place his administrative center in Paydarson. Paydarson Castle had a history of nearly 130 years. Its style originated from the revival of the Elven style during the year of the Return of Glory, and it could be said to be one of the few surviving works of art from that era. It was also one of the proudest places of the Randner family. It symbolized the respect this family had for tradition, and this respect earned them a relatively high reputation among the nobles. Of course, this also complemented Count Randner's good reputation among the nobles of Oween for being a two-faced person. Just like the veteran gatekeeper, Hood had been guarding the gate of the castle for most of his life, but since the November War, this was the first time he saw a knight rushing towards the gate at such a fast speed. The ground shook from the impact of the horse's hooves. The veteran almost thought that his eyes were playing tricks on him. The world is still peaceful right now. Is there a war in the north already? The veteran immediately recognized the knight's attire. It was one of his own. There was an urgent report. Hood was an experienced veteran. He pushed the slow-moving novice aside and gripped the capstan with his bulging veins. The gate immediately creaked as it rose. The knight did not stop at all. He flashed across the drawbridge like a bolt of lightning and went straight into the castle. The report in his hands was quickly passed to the castle's attendant, who then passed it to the steward. It did not take much time to pass it up the chain of command. Count Randner had set 3 levels of urgency for his letters, and this letter was one of them. It had been almost 10 years since such a report appeared. Most of it was military news. Soon the steward rang a bell. The bell was connected to Count Randner's room by a string. Most nobles could use magic, but Count Randner had a hobby. He knew a little about magic because he believed that magic was not a safe thing to do. If he could use machinery, he would definitely not use magic. This was a well-known anecdote among the nobles. When the bell rang on Count Randner's left hand, he was conversing with his guest. Count Randner had a head full of white hair, but no one could tell how old he was. He had participated in the November War. The tragedy of the November War had nothing to do with the nobles. It was a war that greatly damaged the kingdom, and the nobles still remembered it clearly. Monsieur the Count wore a monocle and was neatly dressed, with a black ermine coat with a ruffled ruff of silver, and a handsome beard, though there was a faint smile of benevolence on his face. But to others this smile signified an unfathomable emotion, especially the guest sitting below. This guest was not from Kurlutz, and many people like him did not even admit that they were from Auen. In Erwin's SS, they had a common name, Highlanders. Highlanders, as the name suggested, were the people of the mountains. There were many tribes in Wone that were called Highlanders, and most of them were barbarians. Erwin's Highlanders were a branch of the Na-Tai people. They were considered uncivilized 200 years ago, but after being ruled by the kingdom, they gradually integrated into the civilized world. However, there was one thing that did not change. The Highlanders had always pursued their own independence. Of course, this independence was not tolerated by the kingdom. Thus, the borders of Randner had never been peaceful, and there were all sorts of conflicts and border wars all year round. Of course, not all Highlanders were like this. There were some who were willing to accept the rule of the kingdom. For example, the guest sitting beside Randner came from a region under Randner's rule. His purpose in coming here was very simple. He hoped that Count Randner could reduce the taxes in the south. Due to Madara's invasion, it was an open secret that Madara's army was still entrenched in the south. The flames of war had a devastating effect on the local agriculture and production. Many regions had almost no harvests, and it was difficult to even survive, let alone pay heavy taxes. However, the kingdom did not seem to notice this, and its rule over the Highlanders became even stricter. Count Randner listened carefully to the guest's story. He maintained a smile on his face and did not say anything. For someone of his age, his smile made him seem like a kind old man, but the guest sitting below him did not dare to think so. Most people who thought so did not have a dignified ending. Just as the envoy was about to state his request, the bell on Count Randner's left hand began to ring. The Count's expression changed slightly. This was the first time he could not maintain a smile on his face since this afternoon. He could not remember how long it had been since he received an urgent report. The old man frowned slightly and stood up. However, he did not appear to be rude at all. He politely nodded to the envoy and said, "My apologies, please wait for a moment. Allow me to leave for a moment." "Please, my lord." The envoy stood up in fear and trepidation, not daring to show the slightest dissatisfaction. The old count left the study and opened a door to a room next to it. He immediately saw his aide and assistant waiting for him. Count Randner did not maintain a calm expression in front of his aide for many years. Instead, he immediately asked, "What's the matter?" "It's related to Tonagel." The aide replied. "Is it the same matter as last time?" The count took a silver snuff bottle from a servant beside him and took a puff. "That trash still hasn't been dealt with? It's been half a month." The old noble said angrily. "There's a new report this time. It was sent by Lord Paulus." "Lord Paulus?" Count Randner paused for a moment. Lord Paulus was Grodin's retainer, but he was also his old subordinate. Lord Paulus had participated in the November War with Count Randner. Even though he only participated in a few small battles at the end of the war, he was still Count Randner's most trusted aide. Count Randner did not doubt Lord Paulus' loyalty to him and his family. When he heard that the report was from the old knight, he immediately calmed down and asked, "What did he say?" The aide did not answer. Instead, he passed the letter to Count Randner. "Brando?" Princess Griffin's thin eyebrows finally moved slightly when she heard the name. A hint of surprise flashed in her pale silver eyes. The surprise only lasted for a moment before she furrowed her brows. That young man told you that his name is Brando? The half-fairy princess raised her eyelashes slightly and looked at the guests in front of her. Most people wouldn't easily reveal their true identity under such circumstances. That's for most people. This was the first time Count Bar interrupted. He placed his hand on his chest and bowed slightly, but I don't think he's an ordinary person. Someone who has such a close relationship with the Silver Elves can't be that ordinary. Your Highness, Griffin crossed her slender fingers and rested them on her chin. She was lost in thought for a moment. Golden Apple, Silver Elf, Dragon Magic, Highland Knight? She lowered her head. You said he's a silver-ranked warrior? I'm afraid so. Makarov nodded. 20 years old. Princess Griffin looked at Eichel, but her heart was in turmoil. Oberbeck clearly told her that the young man was at most a black iron. Isn't that the same as Mr. Eichel? He's a true genius, Buger replied. There's another interesting thing. His swordsmanship. What about his swordsmanship? His swordsmanship has a shadow that I'm very familiar with. It's like someone I know. Mr. Buga, please continue. Sword St. Darius. Sword St. Darius? Griffin was puzzled. But Mr. Buga, you said that the young man uses the standard Erewhon's military swordsmanship. It's not the same style as Grandmaster Darius, right? Sword St. Darius also knows how to use military swordsmanship, Fleetwood replied. Your Highness, have you forgotten that he was born in the military? Improved swordsmanship? Princess Griffin's heart skipped a beat. Fleetwood continued, but a 20-year-old silver-ranked swordsman is already very rare. The old man glanced at Eichel as he spoke. The young man lowered his head in embarrassment. The half-elf girl also felt a little emotional when she heard this. The Champions Tournament had just ended, and a group of similarly outstanding youths had emerged. She couldn't help but wonder if Mother Marcia was still looking after Aween. But if that's the case, why is the situation so difficult? Why do I feel so powerless? Griffin felt a little tired, but she immediately used her extraordinary willpower to divert her attention. She took a deep breath and her face lost some color. But she still asked seriously, also Grandmaster Fleetwood. Your Highness, you said that the golden apple in the young man's hand really didn't connect with his soul. Yes, I'm sure that I didn't see wrongly, Fleetwood replied. I can guarantee this with the honor of being a court magician for decades. This time Griffin was really tempted. It was said that the golden apple could change a person's fate and make them change completely. If she had the golden apple, would her weak brother be able to become the real king of Erewhon? But what puzzled her was that anyone who got their hands on the golden apple would immediately think of a way to take it for themselves. But why was that young man unmoved? Was it just a fake? Impossible, her teacher wouldn't have seen wrongly. But Griffin thought that since the young man had such a close relationship with the Silver Elves, he might not be an ordinary person. Maybe he had other plans for the golden apple. Griffin thought of the legends of the Highland Knight, Dragon Magic, and the Silver Elves, and her heart beat faster. Griffin raised her head, her eyes shining. Can we find a way to win him over? Win him over? Everyone was stunned. Of course they wanted to. Whether it was his relationship with the Silver Elves or the owner of the golden apple, they were willing to do so. But they had already offended him, so what could they do? Although the young man showed that he had a good impression of the royal family, it didn't mean anything. It's a little difficult, Makarov immediately replied. No. Griffin smiled and shook her head. She thought it was a little funny. Maybe it's not as difficult as you think if it's the same person. Everyone was stunned. Griffin picked up a letter in front of her with 2 fingers and handed it over. Take a look. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 329. This was the battlefield from more than 10 days ago. There was a faint smell of gunpowder in the air. Even though it was winter, the corpses had been cleaned up according to Brando's strict requirements. The spread of the plague was no joke, and even though the weather was cold, the youths were not willing to take the risk. Thus, apart from the bloodstains on the open ground, there were only fragments of armor and weapons scattered across the grass to prove that a fierce battle had taken place here. A black-feathered bird, a raven or a black-feathered blackbird, flew over the battlefield from a low altitude. The north wind was bleak, and the weather was getting drier and colder by the day. Due to the lack of a sacrifice, Brando had no choice but to deal with the corpses in a simpler way. The black pillars of smoke in the sky were proof of this. The smoke rose above the forest like a scene from the end of the world. When the scouts carefully entered this old battlefield, they couldn't help but look at the black pillar of smoke in the southern sky with trepidation. They crouched down, carefully inspecting the battlefield before standing up and looking at each other in dismay. They were scouts from Paulus. Ever since they received news of Lord Maxon's defeat, they had traveled day and night to this place. At first they did not believe that the rioters were that capable. But when they passed by Lord Maxon's territory, they were surprised to find that it had been occupied by another group of people. Some of them had seen those people before. It was a mercenary group called the Amber Sword. A few months ago they had led a group of refugees across the border, saying that they were going to explore the wilderness. The last news of them was that they had stopped at Port Gris, but only the heavens knew why they had returned here. But the answer to the scouts' doubts was simple, because Brando knew that Lord Maxon would attack Abes. Since that was the case, there was no need to be courteous. In the letter he sent to the Druids, he'd requested for Leto to immediately bring his men across the Parton wastelands. Once Lord Maxon made his move, they would immediately raid his lair. Poor Lord Menta had not the least idea that a mob could be so bold, and had, in fact, suffered a great loss from the very beginning of the war. Of course he himself did not know. By the time he found out, he had already become Brando's prisoner. However, the scouts didn't know about these details. They only sensed the presence of the troops with the keen instincts of spies. They hurriedly left Lord Maxon's territory and traveled south through the night, crossing the Gris River and arriving at the land where a great battle had taken place not long ago. Of course, in Brando's words, the war in their hearts was called a village-level armed melee. He had seen real battles before, and he was not worried about whether he could defeat Lord Maxon or not. This was also why he dared to let Rabban and Cornelius take command of the Firebrand Legion. However, Brando also understood that there would be a fierce battle ahead. At this moment, one end of this fierce battle was in the hands of the scouts who had sneaked into the young man's territory. The rumors are true. Sir Maxon has already lost, and it was a crushing defeat. One of the scouts stood up after inspecting the surroundings, reporting to his companions. Everyone fell silent. Although they had already expected this result, the news of Lord Maxon's defeat had already spread across the Gris River. It wouldn't take long for the news to reach Lord Paulus' ears. However, they still couldn't help but feel a chill run down their spines. Everyone's gaze turned towards the most experienced scout in the group, who was also the one who spoke. The experienced scout pondered for a moment before speaking. The most important thing is to pass the news back. This matter is a little strange. I've been a scout for so long, but I've never heard of such ferocious rioters. He looked around. This is an ambush. An ambush? I heard that Captain Carglaise also participated in this battle. Carglaise was Lord Maxon's son. If one's memory was good enough, they would remember that this young man had once served under Lord Paulus for a period of time. However, that was not the case. Carglaise did not boast because Lord Paulus did not have any children of his own. He had always treated this young man as his own son and passed on all his experiences in war to him. Carglaise's performance did not disappoint the old knight. He performed outstandingly in the battle against the Highlanders and had a high reputation among Lord Paulus' subordinates. Even if he wanted to join Princess Griffine's side, the old knight had also agreed to it. Lord Paulus might be loyal to Count Randner, but he was more inclined towards the royal faction. He hoped that this disciple of his would be able to assist Erwin on the path of revival. Why would Captain Carglaise be ambushed? When he was leading us, we didn't fall for the tricks of the Highlanders. The scout added with some doubt. The scouts fell silent. This matter was too strange. But the old soldier waved his hand and said, I have a suggestion. Let's split into two groups. On one hand you will bring the message back to Lord Paulus. The other will continue to move forward and try our luck at Abes. That's too risky. A young scout said. No scouts are willing to take the risk. The old soldier waved his hand. I have the highest position here. Listen to my orders. All of you go back. Leave 2 people with me. The scouts looked at each other after hearing the order. They were not worried that they would encounter any danger since they were all elites under Lord Paulus. However, ever since they came to the south there was a sense of mystery. This was the first time they wanted to retreat. While the scouts were arguing outside the forest, Rabban and Cornelius looked at each other. They turned around and saw a young man wearing a red robe sitting on a rock not far away. The subterranean dweller chieftain Tajiv was looking at the county with fear. This young adept's spell had completely concealed their auras. Even the most skilled of scouts would not be able to find them. Rabin was not sure if the experienced scouts would be able to detect them at this distance. When he served in the Karsuk Cavalry Regiment, he had seen many scouts in the army. Sometimes as a cavalryman he would occasionally act as a scout or two. However, he had only seen experienced scouts like those outside in the most elite brigades. They were definitely first-rate elites. However, he was more surprised by the county's identity. He came from Karsuk and had seen the mysterious Highland wizards before. He was 100% sure that the county was the same type of people. They had the same aura, the aura of the Highland and the Black Tower. He had heard that Brando was a Highland knight, and at this moment he believed it. But a Highland knight who had a mentor as his squire? What kind of existence was that? While Rabin's mind was in a mess, Cornelius once again withdrew his gaze from the forest. How bold! He was talking about the scouts outside. The scouts had split into two groups. One group was heading towards Abes, while the other was heading north to return to Lord Paulus. They parted ways outside the forest and disappeared into the distance. Hey! Seal looked in that direction and raised his eyebrows slightly. His expression was very similar to Brendel's. In the young wizard's mind, Brendel could be said to be the best master. He was enigmatic and seemed to know everything. He had been trying to imitate Brando's every move recently, and there were signs of him going crazy. However, he immediately laughed at himself. Carglass? I didn't expect that little guy to be so famous among the scouts under Lord Paulus. He has been clamoring for a duel with one of you every day. Don't you two have any objections? Rabin and Cornelius's expression immediately became strange. During the ambush against Lord Maxon, the one who caused them the most trouble was the youth called Carglass. Even Rabin, a veteran, was full of praise for the young man's ability to judge the battlefield. If they hadn't captured Lord Maxon alive in the end, they might have been killed by the young man. However, the county wanted to make fun of the Nightsong Tiger, Rabin, and Cornelius. They had promised that there would be no problems, but in the end they made a mistake. If the county had acted personally, Carglass would have been captured even if he had grown wings. However, it was precisely because of this that the young man was still unconvinced. Although he didn't say anything like starting over as a soldier, he was still clamoring for a duel with Cornelius, the Nightsong Tiger, or Rabin. The youth's swordsmanship was also very good. Cornelius had wanted to teach him a lesson, but he did not expect that he would suffer a loss. From then on, the Nightsong Tiger, Rabin, and Cornelius would take a detour whenever they went near the dungeon to avoid embarrassing themselves. The county had told Brando that there was a child that he needed to educate, and in fact he was referring to this youth. Seeing the two leaders' strange expressions, the youth smiled and shook his head. So, how do you plan to deal with this matter? He changed the topic and pointed outside. How do we deal with it? The silver-haired middle-aged man looked at the county with a questioning gaze. The three of them seemed to have ignored Tajiv, which made the subterranean dwellers' leader unhappy. Speaking of which, it was his men who had discovered the scouts and immediately notified the humans. However, the county did not forget about the subterranean dwellers' leader who had not been living a good life recently. He nodded at Tajiv. Of course, this matter is still Tajiv's contribution. As for how to deal with them, we will capture them. As for how to deal with them, that is Lord Maxon's business. Tajiv puffed out its chest when it heard this. What about the others? Rabin frowned. From the county's words, it seemed like they were going to release the scouts who went back to report the matter. The county nodded. Let them go. This is Lord Maxon's wish. What does that youth mean? Rabin and Cornelius looked at each other. What does he want to do? If he were to release those scouts, it was entirely possible that Lord Paulus would be alerted. If that happened, no one could say for sure what would happen next. However, the county did not answer the question and only looked up at the sky. It seems like Lord Maxon is going to do something big this time. P.S. Aha, it's actually one more chapter. Did you guess correctly? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 330. Brando was prepared to go all out this time. After the series of events in the Shaflund mines, silver was like blood being injected into the veins of the territory, bringing vitality to the territory. At the same time, the benefits obtained from the runic dwarves' sanctuary had greatly exceeded everyone's expectations. Brando quickly found that he had the strength to deal with greater challenges. But it was not just a challenge. Because challenges also represented opportunities, just like how risks and benefits always coexisted. At this time, Brando turned his gaze to the distant north. he decided to give the nobles a louder voice. A voice about the rise of a new power. As part of the plan, this new power had to prove itself to the ancient kingdom as soon as possible, whether it was a warning to the enemy or a confidence to potential allies. Brando considered that his letter should have reached Princess Griffin's hands by now. No matter what the reason was, the news of Lord Maxon's crushing defeat finally reached Count Randner's ears. Of course, it also reached the Royal Cavalry Academy at the same time, where the princess was sitting on the mahogany desk in front of her. The half-fairy princess' thin and thick eyelashes drooped slightly as she sat on a red velvet chair, looking at the two reports on the desk. To be exact, it was a letter and a piece of parchment. Today she wore a well-tailored military uniform, but the special silver uniform accentuated her delicate curves, adding a sense of solemnity and heroism to her delicate appearance. Griffin did not open her mouth to speak, but her pale silver eyes occasionally blinked slightly. After a while, she used her finger to lightly tap on the desk, recovering from this rare state of concentration. She raised her head. Maynard and Oberway were not here. Standing in front of the desk was another group of people. In fact, she only recognized one of them. The half-fairy princess nodded to the old man. "Teacher." The old man wearing a scholar's robe was the court master, Grandmaster Fleetwood. He did not have the arrogance he had when facing Brando, but bowed respectfully. The princess was his proudest disciple, but at the same time she was also the hope for the revival of the royal faction. Even though he had absolute authority when imparting knowledge at this time, he had to show the courtesy of a subject. "Your Highness." Princess Griffin smiled faintly, her gaze sweeping across the other people. She had never seen these people before, but she recognized them one by one. The only young man who was in good spirits, but he did not know what to do. That was Eek. There was a middle-aged man standing beside the young man. Even though he had been through a lot, he still had the temperament of a noble. The half-elf girl remembered seeing him when she was very young. She guessed that he should be Makarov. Makaro the Cunning Fox. The leader of the royal faction. Next to him was a man with long and slender palms. It was obvious that he had been practicing swordsmanship for a long time. Griffin smiled. It was Buga the Cross. The last one, without a doubt, was the rumored noble who was different from the rest, the Violet Earl. Even though the half-fairy princess had never seen Bali before, she had heard of his name. Her gaze stopped on the four people one by one. Based on the clues from the past reports and her own meticulous observation, she recognized these famous guests without Grandmaster Fleetwood's introduction. The son of Duke Anthony, the current successor of the Cross Sword, the former leading figure of the royal faction, and Count Barr, who was known as the cunning fox of this generation. These people could indeed be considered to be famous. Especially the youngest, Eek. Even though Anthony was only a small duchy at the border between Ampere-Seal and Erech, under the current situation, Duke Lone's support was crucial to the princess. Fortunately, Duke Anthony and Duke Erech had always been at odds, and this had already escalated to the level of hatred. Griffin's gaze stopped on Eek's face for a second. This special treatment made the young man blush. He had yet to adapt to his past identity. Anyone who suddenly jumped from a nameless mercenary to a prominent noble would be shocked. Moreover, he did not expect the princess to be so beautiful. As a half-elf, she was known as the brightest jewel in Erewhon's crown. Griffin had a special kind of beauty in her temperament. It was as if she had the coldness of an elf, but also the friendliness of a human. The two opposite temperaments mixed together easily made people who saw her for the first time feel a rush of excitement. Even though she was still young, she already had the potential to cause the downfall of a city. "Mr. Eek," Griffin said, "Lord Makaro, Count Bali, Mr. Buga, I'm very happy that you are here to support the royal family of Covardo at this time." She opened her mouth and pointed out their identities one by one, which obviously surprised them. Only Makaro was happy. He saw that the princess was indeed as outstanding as the rumors said. With such an heir to the royal family of Covardo, he felt that his hopes were not so slim. This cunning fox always believed that humans were the most important, but the human heart was just as important as manpower. He did not like the impulsiveness of the eldest prince. Now that he saw the princess, he felt a lot more at ease. But for some reason he suddenly thought of another young man at this time. He quickly shook his head and expelled this experience from his memory. The Violet Count did not say anything as he looked at the two reports on the princess's desk from afar. He was not interested in the princess's polite words. As for determining their identity, it was not difficult. If Princess Griffin could not even do this, then she would be letting down the rumors about her. On the contrary, he was very interested in why the princess was so engrossed in the reports. He was a person like the princess who rarely revealed her emotions. However, when they came in, the princess was reading the two reports with her hands on her cheeks. As he read, he even smiled slightly. Count Bar was willing to bet that the princess herself didn't even realize that she was laughing just now. Interesting. The unusual nobleman said to himself in his heart. However, he did not speak rashly. Even though he did not stick to the rules, he was not a rash person. It was not his turn to speak at this time. He looked at Fleetwood and sure enough, the old man had already spoken. Your Highness, please don't say that. This old servant is a little late than expected. Fleetwood lowered his head and replied, there were some delays on the way. He looked up and asked, Your Highness, how is the situation in the north right now? Dark clouds are gathering. Princess Griffin looked out of the window and used a simple but appropriate word to describe the movements of the Duke's alliance in the north. Their lobbyists have already entered Ampere Seal, and it seems that they are about to persuade the greedy merchants. Are there any plans to counter them? Makarov asked. Everyone looked at him, but after more than 10 years of experience, this cunning fox had changed. He had become much more practical and no longer followed the rules of the noble circle. Under normal circumstances, it was not his turn to speak. But because of this, Griffin's silver eyes lit up slightly. Unlike the others, this princess appreciated such talents more. I have already asked Princess Magadal. You all know that she has a lot of connections and has a close relationship with the Holy Cathedral. She might be able to turn the situation around. The half-elf girl replied. Is it that nun princess? Fleetwood asked tentatively. The half-elf girl nodded. Is there any protection? Makarov immediately asked. At this stage of the war, the enemy and our side's movements are almost transparent. Once Princess Magadal leaves this place, she might be intercepted. Griffin was even more impressed and she smiled slightly. Of course, Maynard will personally lead the team. Buga raised his eyebrows. Maynard was Madame Miller's daughter and was related to Duke Lone. He had met her once a long time ago. At that time she was still a little girl, but the talent she displayed in swordsmanship was already amazing. He thought that after so many years she should have grown into an outstanding swordsman. Buga knew Maynard and Makarov was no exception. When he heard the name he was obviously relieved, but he still said, Madame Miller's daughter may be outstanding, but she is still a student of the academy. I think that your Highness needs a more experienced leader. Princess Griffin nodded. That is why I did not let them leave immediately but waited for everyone to arrive. Makarov was shocked. He and Buga looked at each other, and they were both impressed by the princess' flawless arrangements. Buga immediately stepped forward and placed a hand on his sword. I will not refuse. Griffin nodded. The room became silent. Even though Duke Lone and the Corvado royal family had a secret agreement to reach, it was not a good time to talk about it. But everyone felt as if there was nothing else to talk about other than this matter. The pressure from the north was getting stronger, and even though everyone's expression was calm, they still felt a sense of urgency. Naturally, they were not in the mood to talk about the affairs of the nobles. Only the half-fairy princess was more relaxed. She smiled at her guests. Everyone, please have a seat. Why don't we talk about something more relaxing? I have been hearing bad news for the past few days. Tell me about some interesting things that happened along the way. If I remember correctly, Mr. Eek was once a mercenary, right? That is a unique and amazing experience among us nobles. Princess Griffin looked at Makarov as she spoke, obviously praising him as well. Also, I remember that Master Fleetwood is always punctual. This time you must have met with some trouble. Can you tell me more about it? Griffin asked in a relaxed tone. Eek was currently in a state of absent-mindedness. He didn't have the ability to answer the princess's question. He could only stammer and stammer. It was Grandmaster Fleetwood who spoke first. It's like this, Your Highness. We did meet with some trouble. It has something to do with the golden apple. The golden apple. Griffin felt her heart skip a beat as she focused her attention. This slight change in the princess's expression was hidden from almost everyone, but only Count Bar saw it. The noble who stood out from the crowd raised his eyebrows. P.S. Hey buddy, don't tell me you don't believe this is real. There's an even bigger surprise to come. However, it seems like your support isn't that great. Chapter 331. Let's turn our attention to Paydarson. The core of Randner province was located at the border between Randner province, Arek, and Frada. Originally, it was to prevent the Highlanders from invading the north, but as the kingdom's rule over the south gradually stabilized, it became the center of political symbolism. Currently, Randner's largest fortress was Fort Balasar, but Count Randner still preferred to place his administrative center in Paydarson. Padarson Castle had a history of nearly 130 years. Its style originated from the revival of the Elven style during the year of the Return of Glory, and it could be said to be one of the few surviving works of art from that era. It was also one of the proudest places of the Randner family. It symbolized the respect this family had for tradition, and this respect earned them a relatively high reputation among the nobles. Of course, this also complemented Count Randner's good reputation among the nobles of Owen for being a two-faced person. Just like the veteran gatekeeper, Hood had been guarding the gate of the castle for most of his life, but since the November War, this was the first time he saw a knight rushing towards the gate at such a fast speed. The ground shook from the impact of the horse's hooves. The veteran almost thought that his eyes were playing tricks on him. The world is still peaceful right now. Is there a war in the north already? The veteran immediately recognized the knight's attire. It was one of his own. There was an urgent report. Hood was an experienced veteran. He pushed the slow-moving novice aside and gripped the capstan with his bulging veins. The gate immediately creaked as it rose. The knight did not stop at all. He flashed across the drawbridge like a bolt of lightning and went straight into the castle. The report in his hands was quickly passed to the castle's attendant, who then passed it to the steward. It did not take much time to pass it up the chain of command. Count Randner had set 3 levels of urgency for his letters, and this letter was one of them. It had been almost 10 years since such a report appeared. Most of it was military news. Soon the steward rang a bell. The bell was connected to Count Randner's room by a string. Most nobles could use magic, but Count Randner had a hobby. He knew a little about magic because he believed that magic was not a safe thing to do. If he could use machinery, he would definitely not use magic. This was a well-known anecdote among the nobles. When the bell rang on Count Randner's left hand, he was conversing with his guest. Count Randner had a head full of white hair, but no one could tell how old he was. He had participated in the November War. The tragedy of the November War had nothing to do with the nobles. It was a war that greatly damaged the kingdom, and the nobles still remembered it clearly. Monsieur the Count wore a monocle and was neatly dressed, with a black ermine coat with a ruffled ruff of silver, and a handsome beard, though there was a faint smile of benevolence on his face. But to others this smile signified an unfathomable emotion, especially the guest sitting below. This guest was not from Kurlutz, and many people like him did not even admit that they were from Awen. In Erwin's SS, they had a common name, Highlanders. Highlanders, as the name suggested, were the people of the mountains. There were many tribes in Wone that were called Highlanders, and most of them were barbarians. Erwin's Highlanders were a branch of the Na-Tai people. They were considered uncivilized 200 years ago, but after being ruled by the kingdom, they gradually integrated into the civilized world. However, there was one thing that did not change. The Highlanders had always pursued their own independence. Of course, this independence was not tolerated by the kingdom. Thus, the borders of Randner had never been peaceful, and there were all sorts of conflicts and border wars all year round. Of course, not all Highlanders were like this. There were some who were willing to accept the rule of the kingdom. For example, the guest sitting beside Randner came from a region under Randner's rule. His purpose in coming here was simple. He hoped that Count Randner could reduce the taxes in the south. Due to the invasion of Madara, and the fact that Madara's army was still entrenched in the south, it was an open secret. The flames of war had a devastating effect on the local agriculture and production. Many regions had almost no harvests. Not to mention the heavy taxes, it was difficult to even survive. However, the kingdom did not seem to notice this. Instead, its rule over the Highlanders became even stricter. Count Randner listened attentively to the guest's story. He maintained a smile on his face throughout and did not express his opinion. For someone of his age, his smile made him seem like a kind old man, but the guest sitting below him did not dare to think so. Most people who thought so did not have a dignified ending. Just as the envoy was about to state his request, the bell on Count Randner's left hand began to ring. The Count's expression changed slightly. This was the first time he could not maintain a smile on his face since this afternoon. He could not remember how long it had been since he received an urgent report. The old man frowned slightly and stood up. However, he did not appear to be rude at all. Instead, he politely nodded to the envoy and said, "My apologies, please wait a moment. Allow me to leave for a moment." "Please, my lord." The envoy stood up in fear and trepidation. He did not dare to show the slightest dissatisfaction. Count Randner left the study and opened a door to a room next to it. He immediately saw his aide and assistant waiting for him. "What's going on?" Count Randner's expression did not remain unchanged in front of his longtime deputy. Instead, he immediately asked with a solemn expression. It's related to Tanajul. The aide replied. Is it the same matter as last time? Count Randner took a silver snuff bottle from the servant beside him and took a puff. That trash still hasn't been dealt with? It's already been half a month. The old noble said angrily. There's a new report this time. It was sent by Lord Paulus. Lord Paulus? Count Randner paused for a moment. Lord Paulus was Grodin's retainer, but he was also Count Randner's old subordinate. Lord Paulus had participated in the November War with Count Randner. Even though he only participated in a few small battles at the end of the war, he was still Count Randner's most trusted aide. Count Randner did not doubt Lord Paulus' loyalty to him and his family. When he heard that the report was from the old knight, he immediately calmed down and asked, What did he say? The aide did not answer. Instead, he passed the letter to Count Randner. Brando? Princess Griffin's thin eyebrows finally moved slightly when she heard the name. A hint of surprise flashed in her pale silver eyes. The surprise only lasted for a moment before she furrowed her brows. That young man told you that his name is Brando? The half-fairy princess raised her eyelashes slightly and looked at the guests in front of her. Most people wouldn't easily reveal their true identity under such circumstances. That's for most people. This was the first time Count Bar interrupted. He placed his hand on his chest and bowed slightly, but I don't think he's an ordinary person. Someone who has such a close relationship with the Silver Elves can't be that ordinary. Your Highness, Griffin crossed her slender fingers and rested them on her chin. She was lost in thought for a moment. Golden Apple, Silver Elf, Dragon Magic, Highland Knight? She lowered her head. You said he's a silver-ranked warrior? I'm afraid so. Makarov nodded. 20 years old. Princess Griffin looked at Eichel, but her heart was in turmoil. Oberbeck clearly told her that the young man was at most an iron-ranked warrior. Isn't that the same as Mr. Eichel? He's a true prodigy, Buga replied. There's another interesting thing, his swordsmanship. What's wrong with his swordsmanship? His swordsmanship has a shadow that I'm very familiar with. It's like someone I know. Mr. Buga, please continue. Sword St. Darius. Sword St. Darius? Griffin was puzzled. But Mr. Buga, you said that the young man uses the standard Erewhon's military swordsmanship. It's not the same as Grandmaster Darius, right? Sword St. Darius also knows how to use military swordsmanship, Fleetwood replied. Your Highness, have you forgotten that he was born in the military? Improved swordsmanship? Princess Griffin's heart skipped a beat. Fleetwood continued, but a 20-year-old silver-ranked swordsman is already very rare. The old man glanced at Eichel as he spoke. The young man lowered his head in embarrassment. The half-elf girl also felt a little emotional when she heard this. The Champions Tournament had just ended, and a group of similarly outstanding youths had emerged. She couldn't help but wonder if Mother Marcia was still looking after Aween. But if that's the case, why is the situation so difficult? Why do I feel so powerless? Griffin felt a little tired, but she immediately used her extraordinary willpower to divert her attention. She took a deep breath and her face lost some color. But she still asked seriously, also Grandmaster Fleetwood. Your Highness, you said that the golden apple in the young man's hand did not form a connection with his soul. Yes, I am certain that I did not see wrongly, Fleetwood replied. I can guarantee this with the honor of being a court magician for decades. This time Griffin was really tempted. It was said that the golden apple could change a person's fate and make them change completely. If she had the golden apple, would her weak brother be able to become the real king of Erewhon? But what puzzled her was that anyone who got their hands on the golden apple would immediately think of a way to take it for themselves. But why was that young man unmoved? Was it just a fake? Impossible, her teacher would not have seen wrongly. But Griffin thought that since the young man had such a close relationship with the Silver Elves, he might not be an ordinary person. Maybe he had other plans for the golden apple. Griffin thought of the legends of the Highland Knight, Dragon Magic, and the Silver Elves, and her heart began to pound. Griffin looked up, her eyes shining. Can we find a way to win him over? Win him over? Everyone was stunned. Of course they wanted to. Whether it was his relationship with the Silver Elves or the owner of the golden apple, they were willing to do so. But they had already offended him, so what could they do? Although the young man showed that he had a good impression of the royal family, it did not mean anything. It's a little difficult. Makarov, the most pragmatic person, immediately replied. No. Griffin smiled and shook her head. She thought that it was a little funny. It might not be as difficult as you think if it is the same person. Everyone was stunned. Griffin picked up a letter in front of her with 2 fingers and handed it over. Take a look. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 332. On the 17th of the month of autumn, written in Tanajul, Baron Abi's territory. Griffin, Your Highness Odorfice. During the battle 2 nights ago, Madara's undead army from the Black Lord, Insursta's side bypassed the 4 southern territories and launched a sneak attack on Abi's castle. Not only did they cause heavy casualties, but Baron Griffin also died in the battle. As a guest of the Baron's hospitality, a knight of the kingdom and the Lord of Valhalla, this humble servant believes that this humble servant is responsible for the defense of this place. After a night of battle, the undead have been repelled. However, in order to prevent the undead from invading again from today onwards, I will temporarily take charge of the defense and administration of this place until the new lord personally appointed by Her Highness arrives. Makarov took the letter and read half of it. His expression turned strange. However, he was still an experienced and knowledgeable person. He coughed and continued reading. Furthermore, this humble servant is questioning Count Randner's responsibility. Why did he conceal the news of Insursta's undead army stopping in the south? And why did he allow Madara's army to bypass the 4 territories without warning? Secondly, I hope that Your Highness will forgive me. Lastly, I will attach a magic stone that recorded the images of the battlefield to prove my words. He raised his head. The magic stone is with me, the princess replied without changing her expression. Please continue reading, Lord Makarov. That's all, Your Highness. No, there's one more sentence. The princess' thick eyelashes drooped slightly. Makarov picked up the letter and saw that there was indeed a line of words at the bottom. His eyelids twitched when he saw the words and he raised his eyebrows slightly. Brando. The scene fell silent. Makarov put the letter back in its original position with a strange expression on his face. He then looked at the others and joked, I know Baron Grodin isn't doing his job well, but this little guy is a little too daring. He thought for a moment but could not find the right words to describe this boldness. This is ridiculous. Grandmaster Fleetwood said coldly, this is a challenge to the kingdom. He's breaking the rules of the game between nobles. Princess Griffin frowned when she heard the word, rules of the game. This subtle change in expression did not escape the eyes of the Violet Countess. What do you all think? She asked. I believe in Mr. Brando's words. Eek was the first to speak. Although the young man was a bit nervous, he still stood up and said, the Mr. Brando I know is a real knight. People can be disguised, young man, said Master Fleetwood. Makarov and the Violet Countess nodded in agreement. As nobles who had experienced many conflicts, they had a much deeper understanding of human nature than ordinary people. The half-elf girl's expression was a little dull. She didn't say a word, and her expression showed neither approval nor disapproval. Her eyelashes fluttered slightly, and she looked at the young man who spoke for the first time with her silver eyes. Grandmaster Fleetwood. Eek bowed respectfully to the old man, but he did not back down. People will not lie in the face of life and death. Moreover, what I saw was actions, not words. The childishness on the young man's face slowly faded away. He looked at everyone present except for Princess Griffin and said, otherwise, I don't think Mr. Brando would be able to reprimand us so righteously. Even the legendary divine artifact acknowledged his words. The half-elf girl was a little surprised. She had heard Makarov and the others mention the divine artifact before. But what did Eek mean when he said that Brando reprimanded them so righteously and caused the divine artifact to react? She looked at the others curiously. Her curiosity was no different from a 15-year-old girl's curiosity towards the outside world, but there was a hint of restraint in her actions. Fleetwood didn't expect Ike to bring up the matter. They had planned to keep it a secret since it wasn't something to be proud of. But when he saw the princess's girlish eyes, he knew he couldn't keep it a secret anymore. If the princess wanted to know something, she would know it. She was smart enough to know it. The Grandmaster coughed and nodded to Makarov. Makarov felt even more helpless because he was the one who was reprimanded the most. Left with no other choice, the cunning fox could only recount the entire incident. He then added, Your Highness, we didn't mean to hide such a small matter. Princess Griffin nodded and said with tolerance, It's not strange to have conflicts due to different viewpoints. But come to think of it, Master Fleetwood, you were the one who taught me this. Fleetwood hurriedly lowered his head in fear and trepidation. He knew that his student was blaming him for trying to hide this matter. This made the old man feel both fear and relief. The fear came from the suspicion of his superior, but the relief came from the fact that the princess was complaining instead of blaming him. This could be considered a form of intimacy. Makarov and Count Bar looked at each other and sighed in relief. The princess had already said that she wouldn't pursue this matter. Although the Violet Earl was nominally under Grand Duke Lone's command, since his lord had chosen a side, he had to serve this new alliance wholeheartedly. Griffin asked again, "But you said that when the young man called Brando reprimanded you, he reacted to the divine artifact. I'm curious, what did he say to cause such a huge commotion?" "He asked us if we still remember the beliefs of the late king," Makarov replied in a low voice. In fact, Brando's question had shaken him greatly. Every question that the young man asked was straight to the point. At least for the royal faction, it was a question of their ideals and pursuit. It sounded intolerable, but they couldn't refute it. Oh. Griffin's interest was piqued. She suddenly remembered the story that Oberway told her. It was the story of a knight leading a group of refugees to attack Madara's army. It was a story that shone in the ancient times when the blood of Erewhon's nobles had yet to turn cold. But what made her heart sway was that this story really happened in the same era as her. That was why she remembered the night in the story. But today she couldn't help but recall that scene. "Can you tell me more about it?" she asked subconsciously. Makarov was in a difficult position. For the first time, the Violet Count beside him took the initiative to stand up. He replied, "Let me repeat." "Thank you." Griffin nodded slightly. Count Bar's expression turned serious. "I remember that during the most glorious era of Erewhon, Erewhon's knight held a bugle and a swallow-tailed flag. When the bugle sounded, the blades of the kingdom charged forward." The room suddenly became quiet. Makarov sighed and continued Count Bar's words. "I remember that the battlefield was a sea of flags embroidered with the golden coat of arms of Corvado, Grinoires, and Erech. I remember that the nobles of that era still kept their oaths. Do you still remember that oath?" "Of course." Griffin closed her eyes and clasped her hands together. She crossed her fingers and put them to her nose as if she was praying. The answer in her heart was clearer than anyone else. She silently said, "I swear the oath of the sage under this sword. I vow to lead my people away from strife and slaughter, away from the arrogance and greed of the nobles of the empire. I vow to not repeat the cold-blooded mistakes of history. I vow to make the nobles of this new kingdom follow the spirit of chivalry. I vow to be fair and strict, upright and brave, merciful and generous. I vow to uphold this vow with all my strength." When the last syllable fell, the weak and strong half-fairy princess was in a daze. What the young man said was so clear that it seemed to have hit the weak spot in her heart. Griffin always thought that she was strong enough, but when someone understood her lifelong dream, the strong half-elf girl was still stunned. She didn't know that there was another her in the other world, and she was using the same determination and hard work to carry out her dream. In that world, Aween was like a small boat in the middle of a stormy sea, but she steered the boat forward with unparalleled faith. The dream that ran through Erewhon's main storyline in the Amber Sword. It was like a light in the dark, attracting all the moths. Whether it was the Valkyrie or Erewhon's players, countless people stepped forward to let their dreams overlap, just to realize the dream of the Princess Regent. In that dream, the late King Eric swore under the sword to lead his knight to break through the darkness and bring warmth and peace to everyone. That dream was shattered. But at this moment, the dream had just been born. Princess Griffin opened her eyes, and the hesitation of the past few days seemed to be swept away. Although the dark clouds in the northern sky were getting thicker and thicker, and the first snow seemed to be ready to fall, she felt that she had found the direction. "He's right." The half-elf girl's expression was a little more serious. But dreams can only be realized by breaking reality. The difficulty will not be reduced because we have become determined. The question is, how do we deal with it? What do you think? She looked up and asked. "Tell me your thoughts on this matter. P.S. There are always countless prophetic emperors. You've all worked hard, so I'll satisfy you all a little." Chapter 333. He's trying to get on our good side. Makarov replied succinctly. "Interesting." The Violet Count smiled. Even though the young man was impulsive, he was not reckless. He was indeed interesting, and the fact that the young man sent the letter at such an opportune time was extremely good. This was obviously not a coincidence. Bar raised his head and glanced at Makarov, thinking that the old fox must have noticed this as well. But what does he want? If he wants support, it's too naive to rely on a letter that can't even be considered a pledge of allegiance. Someone who can send such a letter is definitely not so naive. But if he only wants a promise from the royal faction and the princess, then how is he going to resolve the crisis? Empty words will not be able to stop an army. The Violet Count was suddenly very curious. This young man's actions were like walking on a tightrope, dangerous and exciting. But what made him even more interested was that this was the first time he could not see through the outcome of a matter. Interesting. He just wants us to shelter him from the wind and rain. Fleetwood furrowed his brows. How can there be such a good thing, Your Highness? If we agree to his request, we will greatly offend Count Randner. Princess Griffin furrowed her brows. Count Randner was not a reliable ally to her, and it was more like a knife that was hanging behind her back. But this old man had not made his stance clear. Just like what her teacher said, it would be unwise to force him to side with the royal family. Humph, an old fox. Griffin rubbed her forehead in annoyance. I don't think that young man doesn't know about this, Makarov thought for a while and interrupted. He should know who's more important in our hearts, him and Count Randner. Makarov, you mean? Princess Griffin muttered to herself for a moment, and her silver eyes lit up. She looked at the letter on the table. If that's the case, why did he send this letter? I don't think it's to mock our intelligence, Makarov asked. This witty remark made the Violet Countess smile. Princess Griffin's expression also became gentler. Only Wood snorted softly. That's right. There are two meanings behind the word shelter. Count Bar agreed with Makarov's point of view. I think this young man is trying to be friendly with us, but he doesn't want to join us. He knows his place very well. Then what does he want to do? Grandmaster Fleetwood's snow-white eyebrows twitched. Although he was Erewhon's chief court magician, he had devoted his whole life to learning more advanced magic skills, so he still didn't know much about the fights between nobles. What does he want to do? Didn't he make it very clear? The Violet Earl smiled. Although Grandmaster Fleetwood was not good at reading people's minds, he was still a wise man who had made it this far on the path of wizardry. Are you saying that he wants us to admit his words? Grandmaster Fleetwood asked. He frowned. Even though he did not have a good impression of the young man, he had to admit that it was a worthwhile investment if he could gain Brendel's goodwill. The old man knew his place. He was Erewhon's court magician, the mentor of this half-fairy princess and Grandmaster Fleetwood. His personal likes and dislikes had to be placed behind the interests of the group. There's no need to accept his words. This youth's goal is clear. He wants to go against Count Randner, but he wants to avoid attracting everyone's attention. Makarov was the one who saw through Brendel's intentions the clearest. His target is Count Randner, but he wants to avoid being attacked by everyone. But his actions are already a challenge to all the nobles. No one has ever dared to take over a legitimate noble's territory. This precedent, the old man shook his head worriedly. This young man didn't take it by force. Count Bar shook his head and said in amusement. Makarov glanced at him. He was curious why the Violet Count, who usually did not have any preferences, would side with the young man. However, he still replied, that depends on how others interpret it. Most importantly, how we interpret it is. Sometimes an excuse and a direct confrontation are two completely different things, Makarov replied. His letter said that the magic stone used to record the information. Has your highness seen it? I did. Griffin nodded. There is indeed Madara's army and there are more than a few of them, Griffin snorted. I don't want to get involved in the conflict between Count Randner and Madara, but, she did not finish her sentence, but the dissatisfaction in her words was very obvious. He's well prepared. Count Bar was referring to Brando. He was starting to admire the young man more and more. Then let's see what benefits we can get. Makarov's expression became serious. We can't give up on Count Randner. But there's something that surprised me. Everyone looked at Makarov, waiting for him to continue. He seems to have seen through our relationship with Count Randner. He wants to use us as a pawn. A pawn? Grandmaster Fleetwood was puzzled. Amazing. Count Bar's eyes lit up. Even he did not see through Brendel's intentions. This is a good move to force Count Randner into a corner. Yes, Makarov nodded. Unlike the Violet Count's surprise, Makarov was a little apprehensive. Putting aside how Brando managed to guess the thoughts of the royal faction, just his foresight towards Erewhon was enough to make him raise his guard. This young man is trying to get on our good side. Count Randner should know that there are no secrets between nobles. Then, Makarov continued, what do you think that old fox will do? If he chooses to side with Duke Arek, what kind of situation will he face? He will be attacked from the back. The Violet Countess listened quietly. She couldn't help but look at the old leader of the royal faction, whose hair had turned gray, but who was still as elegant as ever. She couldn't help but think to herself, only this person could see through the situation so clearly. As expected, the older the wiser. But what benefits does he have by doing this? Princess Griffin nodded in agreement after listening to Makarov's words. He's willing to be our pawn. If we can get Count Randner to side with us, we can abandon him at any time. I'm sure he understands this. Grandmaster Fleetwood was startled. He felt that the young man was not as hateful as he thought, but he still hesitated. That young man seems to have a good impression of us. He might be willing to side with us. Besides, we're the only ones who can cover this up for him. Count Bar glanced at the old man. A scholar will always be a scholar, and he will never become a politician. He continued, what this young man wants is simple. He wants to play a game of balance. He's choosing a side, and he's certain that Count Randner will not side with us. What a gambler. A voice came from outside the door. The knight outside opened the door, and a noble wearing a mink coat walked in. Seeing the familiar face, Makarov was slightly startled. Oberway. When he was still in the royal faction, Oberway was just a smart and capable young man. But at this moment, the impulsiveness and sharpness on his youthful face had receded, and his temperament had become steady and sharp. Oberway looked at Makarov and bowed slightly to the princess. Your Highness. He then greeted Makarov, Lord Makarov. Oberway's position in the king's party was slightly higher than Makarov's, but Oberway's humble attitude made Makarov very happy. He nodded and smiled, Lord Oberway. You're welcome. Oberway raised his head and replied, let's continue the topic from before. I believe that Lord Makarov and Count Bar's analysis is not without reason, but I have something to say about what the young man wants. The room became silent. Everyone's gaze was on the uninvited guest, especially Princess Griffin. Out of everyone present, she was the only one who knew that the Wolf Baron was the one who understood the youth the most. Oberway looked around and smiled. Some people are not worthy of being chess pieces, they are mediocre. Some people unconsciously become chess pieces for others, they are fools. But if this young man takes the initiative to become our chess piece, then he is a chess player. Chess player? Yes, even if he only controls one chess piece, he can still be considered a chess player. It's just that in this game of chess he's already on the same level as us. Oberway paused, he's a chess piece but so are we. It's just that we have more resources. Everyone was silent. So, Oberway, you're saying that he wants to participate in this game? Even the half-elf girl was in disbelief. She took a deep breath and said, isn't this like trying to gain something without risking anything? This is too infuriating. Yes, Oberway shook his head and saw the helplessness in Makarov's eyes, but we can only choose to accept because his proposal is the most beneficial choice for us. What a cunning fellow. Fleetwood shook his head and suddenly felt that he should not have participated in this discussion. He rubbed his forehead. Then what should we do? The old man asked tiredly. Just smooth things over. Oberway made the final decision. As for the rest, he smiled, let's just watch the young man perform. Perform? Everyone was in disbelief. Even Eek, who had the most confidence in Brando, could not help but worry. On one side was a young man with nothing, and on the other side was the cunning and powerful Count Randner. Perhaps Brando had the Silver Elves behind him, but the Silver Elves had already made it clear that they would not interfere in Erwin's internal strife. Then where did his confidence come from? Princess Griffin was the only one who looked at the report on the table thoughtfully. There was only a simple sentence written on the report. Trentheim, Sir Maxon suffered a crushing defeat. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.gdian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 334. After Count Randner finished reading the report in his hand, he gently placed the parchment on top of the fireplace. This old noble who had experienced many hardships in life fell into a rare silence. After a while, he raised his head and looked at his trusted aide with a gloomy expression. You're trash and your subordinates are trash as well. How long ago was this report? Half a month ago. It's been half a month and Tonagel has caused such a huge mess. My lord, this might not be a riot. Count Randner's trusted aide said, no matter how weak Lord Maxon is, he shouldn't have been defeated by a bunch of mobs. They're mercenaries, but mercenaries are annoying flies. If they don't smell the stench of profit, they won't come buzzing over. Count Randner replied, there's someone behind this. Even though the report mentioned that Grodin had offended the mercenaries, the old noble who had experienced many hardships in his life knew that they would not easily go against a lord without sufficient conditions. They would definitely think that Grodin had Count Randner's backing. Count Randner calmed down and tapped the emerald ring on his right index finger with his left hand. Those who were familiar with him knew that this meant that he was deep in thought, and should not be disturbed when he was deep in thought. Count Randner's trusted aide saw this and shut his mouth, waiting for him to make a decision. "I'm only concerned about two things," Count Randner replied after a long pause. "First, is Grodin dead or alive? Second, who is the person behind all this?" Count Randner's trusted aide lowered his head and pretended to listen carefully. He knew that this important person had not finished speaking yet. But at this moment the door was opened with a creak, interrupting Count Randner's words. A tall youth rushed in from outside. "Father." The youth's voice was faster than the person's, and his voice was full of energy. "How many times have I told you to knock before you come in?" Randner looked at the newcomer and replied coldly, "How many times have I told you to knock before you enter? Didn't you tell me before, father? A man of great ambition doesn't bother with trifles." The young man strode to his father's side. This young man was Count Randner's second son, and he was the only one who did not receive a fief at his age. He gave up his fief on his own accord and insisted on staying by Count Randner's side. Count Randner naturally understood his son's thoughts, but he did not mind. "Seems like you already know?" The urgent news had alarmed the entire castle. He did not think it was strange for his son to rush over so quickly. If he did not know, it meant that his son was not alert enough. "Well, did something happen?" The young man looked around, then casually sat on the sofa at the side and raised his head to ask. "Something happened to your brother?" "Really?" Count Randner raised an eyebrow, and for the first time, he spoke with a hint of anger in his voice. "Why do you sound so happy when your brother is in trouble?" "I'm sorry, father." The young man picked up the cup on the side and then put it down with a smile. "I know it's not very good, but I have no choice. I still don't know how to hide my emotions." The smile on his face was obvious, and it was obvious that Count Randner was right. Count Randner shook his head. He was the same in the past, but this was a small matter in his eyes. The conflict between families was one thing, but it was different when outsiders hurt his descendants. This was a precedent that could not be set in any noble family. Even the conflicts between nobles rarely involved killing each other. Conspiracy and violence were two different things. The blood of nobles was precious, and it could not be spilled in vain. When Count Randner received this report, he had already made up his mind to take revenge in a bloody manner to serve as a warning to others. However, he did not think that this matter was as simple as it seemed. He patted the report and said, "There's a riot in Tanajil, and we don't know if your brother is still alive or not." He paused for a moment, "But I think he's most likely dead." Count Randner snorted coldly and ordered his trusted aide to explain the current situation to him. "Lord Maxon was defeated?" The young man shook his head when he heard that his brother was killed by a group of rioters. In his eyes, rioters were rioters, and it was too shameful for a lord to die in a riot. Even he could not help but feel a little gloomy. No matter what, Lord Maxon was still his younger brother, and it was hard for him to raise his head in front of outsiders. But when he heard the news of Lord Maxon's defeat, his expression changed completely. This was not a riot. The young man might be carefree, but he was a person with dense thoughts. He immediately stood up and said to Count Randner, "Father, there's something fishy behind this. Please allow me to summon the army immediately. I will make the person behind all of this pay the price." Count Randner looked at his son and shook his head in disappointment. "Do you know who's behind all of this?" The young man was stunned for a moment before he replied, "As long as the army presses on the border, they will reveal their true colors." "You're not too stupid." Count Randner's expression softened a little, but he still shook his head. "It's not a bad idea, but someone is waiting for us to make a fool of ourselves. If you mobilize the army, won't you be sending the laughingstock to them?" The young man frowned. The experienced old man tapped his forehead. "You need to use your brain more. The sword in your hand can destroy your enemies, but it can't lead you to victory. Think about it again. Of course, whoever benefits from it has the motive." The young man replied. "Correct," Count Randner nodded. "The kingdom is divided into 3 factions, but the most likely to do so is the princess's faction. That cunning little girl really made people feel uneasy. Because what they lacked was time, she wanted to pressure me. She's underestimating the Randner family. But it's not impossible that someone is trying to sow discord, father." The young man did not want his father to side with Erek because of this. He wanted the princess to pull him to her side. Of course, it would be best if they could form an alliance through marriage. With the princess's help, his position as the heir to the family would be in the bag. Besides, he had long heard of the beauty of the half-fairy princess. Her reputation as the most dazzling jewel on the ancient kingdom's crown was not only in Erewhon, but also in the nearby Cruz Empire. However, Count Randner saw through his thoughts. The old man with a gloomy expression looked at his son coldly. "Don't worry, I'm not going to lose my head over this matter. I'm already past your age." "Father? You must remember one thing, André," Count Randner said sternly. "It doesn't matter which faction the Randner family favors. What's important is that the Randner family must maintain, or at least obtain, an even more independent status than it is now." The old man raised an eyebrow and said in a gloomy tone, "If you can't obtain that much, then don't think so much. It's important to set your own goals. Greedy people will only make others hate you." The young man paused for a moment, then shrugged. "Of course I understand. But what should we do now?" Count Randner tapped the emerald ring on his right index finger and replied coldly, "That sly little girl tried to play tricks on me, so the Randner family must pay her back in kind. She killed my son, so I'll eat her chess piece. Let's see what she's going to do next." Then? The young man patted the hilt of his sword excitedly. "No, there's always an opportunity in danger. We can't handle this matter like this. If I have to personally deal with a small rebellion in a small territory, then won't the Randner family be lowering their status?" The old count shook his head. He was dissatisfied with the young man's eagerness. "Besides, that cunning girl and Dukarek are keeping a close eye on me. I can't afford to let them take me lightly at this time." The young man clicked his tongue and threw his sword on the sofa. "I understand, father. You have a plan." Count Randner trembled in anger at Brendel's sloppy actions, but before he could reprimand him, Brendel had already interrupted him. "If we don't act, Lord Paulus won't be a match for those rioters, father." The young man rested his hands on the back of the sofa and leaned back comfortably with a lazy expression. "That old knight might have a decent army, but his strength is limited compared to Lord Maxon's. If Lord Maxon loses, then this knight won't win either, right?" Count Randner nodded with a gloomy face. Even though he did not like his son's behavior, he had to admit that his second son was the most outstanding among his sons. While the rest of his sons were not as useless as Grodin, they were still mediocre. "Let me think, father," the young man replied. "Don't tell me you want those skeletons from Madara to act. They might have the ability to do so, but they are not of our race. Lord Paulus, that honest knight, might not be able to control them." "In other words, father, do you really trust them? That smiling and Sursta dragon? I heard that he's just a knight in Madara. Why not?" Count Randner said in a low voice. He no longer looked at his son and turned to his confidant. "Help me draft 2 letters, Count Randner?" The confidant raised his head. "The first letter, write it to the dark nobles of Madara. Tell them that the thing they want is still in Abes. If they still want to complete the deal with me, then they have to contribute." Count Randner ordered coldly. "The second letter, give it to the messenger of the mountain people. Don't they want to be exempted from taxes? Tell them that if they are willing to participate in this war, not only will I reduce their taxes, I will also provide food for their troops. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support legal reading. Chapter 335. The young man on the sofa snorted at the count's order. He had to admit that it was a good move to borrow someone else's knife to kill. However, the subordinate was slightly taken aback and quickly lowered his head. No one knew better than him the consequences of the count's order. Madara's invasion had brought about an unprecedented predicament for the Highlanders. At this moment, to the people living in the mountains and forests, whether it was tax exemption or not, it could be said to be a life-saving measure. Thus, he believed that the count would not refuse, nor could he refuse. As for war, wasn't war a common occurrence for the barbarians? He immediately calculated in his mind. Even if he did not include Madara's and Lord Paulus's troops, the Highlanders' army alone would exceed 10,000 men. This number made him a little shaken. This time the count, who had always been low-key, was determined to show Duke Arek and Princess Griffin his strength. But how many years had it been since he last did this? 10 years or 20 years? Since the last time the kingdom was in turmoil, it was as if a generation had grown up in the blink of an eye. But this did not mean that the old man had lost his courage. The subordinate who had followed Count Randner for many years secretly glanced at his lord and the young man on the sofa. The old count's hair was already white, but his eyes were gloomy and sharp. The 3 men present understood that once these 2 letters were sent out, the footsteps of war could no longer be stopped. But the situation was just so strange. When everyone's attention was focused on the war in the north, Who would have thought that the beginning of the Civil War would unfold at the southernmost border of this ancient country that no one paid attention to? In Trentheim, which was so remote that it seemed to have been forgotten by everyone, the footsteps of war quietly approached. But at this moment, Brando did not have much understanding of the army that came from the Randner region and was about to arrive at the border. Perhaps he knew that the direction of history had changed. Once the news of Lord Maxon's defeat spread, it meant that he had included himself in the huge wheel of the Civil War that would decide Erwin's fate. As for the outcome, it would depend on the performance of all sides. However, at this moment what Brando was thinking about the most was not this problem. He was currently sitting in a carriage heading to Furber from Schaflund. The carriage was bumpy due to the mountain roads, but the young man was still staring at the blue sky outside the window. For a moment he was in a daze. The reason why he abandoned all matters related to Schaflund's silver mines and left for Castle Abies in the middle of the night was not because he received news of Count Randner's army approaching the border, nor was it because he received an accurate reply from Princess Regent. It was because of another reason. However, Brando withdrew his gaze from the changing scenery outside the window. His eyes fell on a familiar old dwarf on the opposite side of the carriage. Then he and the dwarf stared at each other. "Mr. Odom," the young man spoke first, "I would like to know what happened to you." The old dwarf was stunned for a moment. He showed a confused expression as he stuffed a piece of dessert into his mouth. "What do you mean by what happened?" In fact, the old dwarf had already unceremoniously eaten half of the desserts that Fela prepared for him in the hidden compartment of the carriage. Now he was about to finish the other half. Brando lost his appetite when he saw the way the dwarf ate. Of course, this was probably the dwarf's strategy. At least it seemed to be working. "I don't remember inviting you to travel with me, right?" Brando said in an annoyed tone. "Aren't you doing well in the mines? I didn't ask you to leave either, so why are you always walking around in front of me?" He thought for a moment and took a deep breath before he added, "Since half a month ago, are you talking about this?" The old dwarf almost choked. He quickly patted his chest and swallowed the dessert. Well said. Young man, this is a problem." Brando felt the corner of his eyes twitching. He felt that if he could, he would kick the old dwarf off the carriage. However, he did not have the mood to do so and coldly replied, "Mr. Odom, if that's the case, can I ask you to get off the carriage now?" No. The old dwarf hurriedly shook his stubby hand. Of course not. Reason? Let me think." Odom was obviously in a difficult position. He could not say that he wanted to see if Brendel had the potential to become the king of the earth and have all the rune dwarves follow him. He felt that if he said that, Odom would definitely treat him as a lunatic. The old dwarf thought for a while and finally found an excuse. "Young man, don't you need someone to do something for you?" Brando felt that he was about to laugh out loud. "All right, then what can you do, old man?" Odom blurted out, "I can explore mines and I'm very good at mining. I'm a disciple of the Golden Dwarves. You know that even though the Rune Dwarves are not good at mining, the Golden Dwarves are good at mining?" "Yes, you don't have to say any more." Brando shook his head. "Since you're so good at mining, why don't you stay in the mines?" The old dwarf froze. He stood there for a long time before stuttering, Even though I'm good at mining, I actually want to change my job?" He forced a smile at Brando as he spoke. It was an extremely forced smile. Brando suddenly felt that it was not that uncomfortable to talk to this old dwarf. At least he knew that his actions were strange. "Then what do you want to do?" the young man asked with a mocking tone. The old dwarf scratched his head. This was a difficult question for him. Other than working in the mines, what else could he do? Odom felt that this question was too strange. What kind of joke was this? He was a rune dwarf who grew up in the Golden Dwarfs tribe. Other than mining, what else could he do? Was this not purposely making things difficult for him? If it was any other person who asked this question, Odom would definitely teach that person a lesson. But he knew that this awkward situation was something he brought upon himself. He hesitated for a long time before finally saying with difficulty, "I know a little construction." Odom did not lie to Brando. This old dwarf did know a little about construction. Construction and engineering was actually his hobby. This hobby came from the fact that he believed that rune dwarves should more or less have some knowledge about construction. But of course, his knowledge of construction did not come from the rune dwarves' inheritance. It was something that he had pieced together. In other words, he was still a miner. That was why the old dwarf did not have much confidence when he spoke. But Brando's interest was piqued. Others might not know what the rune dwarves did, but he knew. When he heard Odom say that he knew how to build, His eyes lit up and even his worries were thrown to the back of his mind. You said that you know how to build? Brando's voice was raised by 3 octaves. But the young man's raised voice gave the old dwarf a fright. His originally weak answer became even weaker. I know a little, but with the stubborn nature of the dwarves, Odom suddenly realized that he could not appear weak. He was a dwarf and not just a dwarf. He was a silver citizen, the only bloodline of the Rune dwarves. He immediately coughed and replied, Kid, you see, everyone starts from nothing. Although I only know a little, it only means that I don't have enough experience. You also know that I used to be a miner. These nonsensical words sounded like they were full of loopholes, and even Romaine might not believe them if she was here. But Brendel, who had long been superstitious about the Rune dwarf's talent in construction, listened to her. The young man felt that there was a chance and nodded. I understand. You know how to build a city? You want to build a city? The old dwarf was shocked. Building a city was not an ordinary construction project. He immediately thought that if he were to build a city with his own ability, he might end up like this. He could imagine that the city he built would be located somewhere crookedly and become a famous site in the future. Of course, that would be a negative example. All the Rune dwarves, and even other dwarves, would probably come here and say that to their descendants with a sense of pilgrimage. See, that's the work of the boastful old dwarf, Odom. He even forgot to build a city gate. The old dwarf immediately broke out in cold sweat. He quickly shook his head to get rid of the messy thoughts because he saw the hope on Brando's face. How is it? Brando asked in an extremely enticing tone. Not just building a city but a huge fortress. As long as it's built, your name will be passed down forever. The young man lowered his voice and spoke in a distant tone. See, that's the work of the dwarven master builder Odom. He's the one who brought back the glory of the Rune dwarves. Don't tell me you don't know what your ancestors were best at? The words the glory of the Rune dwarves moved Odom, or rather, it gave him a huge calming pill. The scene that Brando described to him made him forget that he was a typical 3-legged cat in this aspect. The old dwarf immediately confirmed his thoughts. That's right, I'm the descendant of the Rune dwarves. I can't be that bad. And so he nodded with all his might. Good. Brando, who did not know what was going on, felt relieved. He felt that someone had sent him a pillow when he wanted to sleep. It seemed that Lady Martha still cared for him. With the help of a Rune dwarf's descendant, building a fortress would not be a problem. Brando felt that he had profited greatly, and so did Odom. Both of them could see a bright future ahead of them. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 336. The gate behind the drawbridge creaked as the black carriage drove into Coldwood Castle like a ghost. The atmosphere in the castle seemed to have suddenly become silent. The mercenaries stopped to watch, and almost everyone understood. The young lord had returned. Since Yuta was still in the Shaflund mines, no one had brought back the news of what had happened underground. However, everyone in the castle knew that Brando had only brought 20 men with him to quietly take over the mines. What kind of method was that? Even though the young lord's abilities were deeply ingrained in everyone's hearts, his actions had once again created an image of him as an omnipotent being. When Brando opened the carriage door, he saw that the castle was still shrouded in silence and green even though it was late autumn. The first owner of the castle had carefully selected the trees in the castle so that it would remain green even in this season. However, there were not many changes compared to when he left the castle. The only thing that changed was that Grodin's original style was much less, and the curtains in the rooms were all changed to his favorite beige color. Although the young man didn't know how Falerne knew about his hobbies, the elder sister of the Wild Elf sisters, who always followed him around like a secretary, still made him feel warm in his heart. If there was anything that changed about the castle, it was that it made him feel like he had returned home. The word home was distant and unfamiliar to Brando, as if it had nothing to do with him. The old house in Bucci was like a symbol in his mind, symbolizing his starting point in this world. It had nothing to do with his home. Perhaps Brando still had a home in Bragg's, but whenever he thought of that home, there would always be a barrier in his heart. He knew that as long as he had doubts in his heart, he would not be able to face everything calmly. But today, when he stepped out of the carriage and saw every detail in the quiet castle, he felt a sense of security in his heart. Whether it was the grass and trees in the castle, the clean rooms with bright windows, or the people in the surroundings, they all had a calming feeling that seeped into one's soul. It made him feel like he was back. Brando involuntarily closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Only at this moment could he deeply feel that he was the master of this place. Everyone in this castle, including those who were looking at him. What do they hope for? Is it to settle down or to live a better life? Brando suddenly had a feeling that he was not fighting alone. He thought that he finally had the dreams of so many people standing together with him. No matter what their ultimate goal was, Brando believed that he would satisfy everyone. With predictable confidence. Brando opened his eyes and saw the expressionless wild elf sister standing in front of him with her notebook in her hands. She stood straight and had a meticulous expression. Even the most professional etiquette teacher would not be able to find fault with her. To him, this elven lady was now his secretary and personal maid. He knew that this was the Nightsong Tiger's order, but she was doing her job diligently. As a former otaku, Brando did not have a fetish for uniforms, but he felt that Falern's care was very considerate. He looked at the young lady and said softly, "Thank you." The wild elf sister looked at him with her dead fish eyes and lowered her head again. She did not refute, but it seemed that she was satisfied with his thanks. "How is it?" Brando asked again. "The Shire is still in his room," Falern replied. Even though she was a maid, she had the rare strength of a silver-ranked warrior. In fact, many dukes would not have the honor of having such a personal maid. Of course, it was a different story for a shadow guard. However, using a silver-ranked elementalist as a maid was something that shocked everyone who knew about it. It was a good thing that the Nightsong Tiger and the others had not shown their true strength yet, or else Cornelius and Rabin would have been shocked by their strength. The reason why the mercenaries of Lopez were able to increase their strength was because of the 10,000 Mammoth Forest card that he had added to their cards. The effect of the 10,000 Mammoth Forest card was slightly weaker than expected, and it only increased their strength to upper silver-ranked. However, this also meant that Brando had an army of silver-ranked warriors. A silver-ranked warrior in the kingdom's irregular army could obtain the position of a leader. Furthermore, the mercenaries of Lopez's military discipline was not bad. Brando even thought of making them the backbone of his army. However, the identity of a summoned creature was still a little troublesome. Brando did not think that any of his soldiers would be willing to charge together with a commander who could revive even if they died. This matter made him rub his forehead. There was no other reason other than the fact that he did not have enough talented people around him. Other than a summoned creature, it was almost impossible to find a person who could hold their own. Even though Amandina had a calm analytical ability and broad vision, he still felt that this noble's daughter still lacked experience. In fact, Brando was a little nitpicky. After all, he had 100 years of experience in fighting against nobles. Even though it was in the game, experience would not fade no matter where it was. In the eyes of someone like him, his vision was a little too high. In the eyes of many mercenary leaders, Amandina could be said to be the best tactician. She was meticulous, calm, and had her own opinions. She was far-sighted, thoughtful, and could always see things that others could not see. Not to mention she also had a vast knowledge as if she knew everything. In this aspect, only the Shire could talk to her. When the others were called to a meeting by this young lady, they would sometimes feel like they were in a fog. However, they had to admit that her words were very reasonable. In fact, they had long been guessing who this young lady was. Even the confidants of the nobles who gave advice to them were probably nothing special. In this aspect, Rabin was more experienced, to the point that this former captain of the cavalry looked at Amandina with a strange gaze. In his view, this young lady was one of those rich nobles with a long history who were specially trained to serve their children. Of course, being born as a rude and uneducated soldier, Rabin could not help but think that this young lady might have to satisfy her lord's less than honorable needs when necessary. This guess was not only in Rabin's mind but more or less the mercenaries more or less had the same thought. After all, Amandina's actions sometimes exceeded the scope of an advisor. Brando gave her a lot of power, and this kind of trust was hard to imagine. There was only one explanation. Amandina was the young lord's woman. It was a pity that Brando was not aware of this small matter, and the young lady who was aware of it turned a blind eye to it. Thus, this kind of misunderstanding was tacitly maintained. Of course, back to the main topic. Brando's dissatisfaction with Amandina was sometimes revealed, and this kind of dissatisfaction that was close to being lectured did not mean that the young lady had fallen out of favor, but it was a sign that he valued her. However, this also made them speechless at the high standards of their lord, but Brando's reprimands were not unreasonable most of the time, and thus the mercenaries naturally had a thought in their minds. What is high? This is high. Thus, Brando was naturally shrouded in a layer of halo, and almost everyone thought that he was the real noble who was sent out by the ancient nobles to gain experience. Only the female mercenary leader Yuta, who had the most dealings with nobles, doubted this statement. Cornelius and Rabban chose to believe in their intuition, but it was a pity that a man's intuition was often unreliable. In short, in their opinion, Brando would definitely bring them a bright future. On the other hand, other than Amandina, the only one who caught Brendel's attention was Rabban, the former captain of Karsuk's cavalry squad. He was probably the only one who was calm and had a certain level of military discipline. He was even more outstanding than Jana, who was serious in her work. From Brando's point of view, Yuta's flaw was that she was too meticulous. Even though women were naturally suspicious, there were times when a person who wanted to achieve great things did not care about trifles. People who were tangled up in details would not be able to see far into the future. This was also the reason why Rabban and Cornelius were able to see through the situation quickly and accepted into his group, while Amandina was unable to fit in. The incident at the mines seemed to have dispelled her doubts. She had already assured him that he could leave Schaflund and leave her there to monitor Perkins' every move. This meant that Amandina could leave her subordinates in Abyss to him without any worries. She believed that he would not take the opportunity to do anything that she would regret. But in truth it was already a little too late. Cornelius and Rabban had already found their positions, while Amandina had to start from the beginning. She had already lost by half a step from the beginning. Thus Brando did not have high hopes for her. As for Cornelius, even though he was strong enough, he was too sly. Brando would never trust such a person before he had the strength to control him. As a former commander, he knew how to use a person wisely. Rabban, on the other hand, was bold and calm enough to see the situation clearly. However, his only flaw was that his vision was too narrow. Brando could not help but laugh at this thought. How far could he ask a cavalry captain to see? After all, they were not players in the past who could look at the problems of this world from a perspective that transcended beyond it. Thus, players were born to be on equal footing with nobles, but these people could not. Even though people could change, Brando did not have the time to do so. The problem he was facing now was different from the game where he could slowly level up. His enemies were much stronger than him from the start, and they would not give him the time to slowly grow his wings. He looked at Rabban and Cornelius, who were also standing by the side, and could not help but shake his head. Where was the talent he needed? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.